in both respects?
No, I didn't have him visually. I had him on the radar. He was exactly 10 miles ahead of us. I asked him at the time how everything was going. Just wait once. I asked him how he was making out with his problem. He said he lost those vents and he had a lift, and he said he was holding his own. The last time I talked with him, he said he was holding his own, and that's the last time I lost contact after that.
On Whitefish Point, in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, families play on the sandy shore of Lake Superior. Freighters can be seen passing into Whitefish Bay, where they will enter the Sulaks for transfer to the other Great Lakes. This was the immediate destination of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, which was looking for the Whitefish Point light when it succumbed to the waves during a terrible storm on November 10, 1975. The wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald lies just 17 miles north-northwest of the point and the safe harbor its beacon promised. You know the name, you know the song, you know the number. Each year on the 10th day of November, bells ring 29 times in memory of the men who went down with the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Frederick J. Beecher, Porter. Thomas Benson, oiler. Joseph W. Mazie, special maintenance man. And a final toll for all those sailors that were lost on the lakes.
When the news broke, the wreck was immediately recognized as a tragedy of historic proportions. Families, friends, and the entire Great Lakes community mourned. Over the decades, though, the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald has become something much larger. A mystery, a symbol, a touch point. It's become one of the best-known shipwrecks, not just on Lake Superior, but in the world. There are things we will never know about the night the Edmund Fitzgerald went down, but there's a lot that we do know. In this podcast, we'll tell the story of the ship, its loss, and its legacy. We'll talk to authors who've written books about the Fitz and staff members at museums that have become stewards of pieces of the wreck. We'll hear from a man who was part of the Coast Guard response to the sinking and from a diver who has actually touched the wreck. We'll hear from the TV anchor who broke the news and from a man who knew Gordon Lightfoot, the songwriter who immortalized the tragedy in music. By the end of 5 episodes, you'll understand what kind of boat the Fitzgerald was and what its crew members were doing out there in the gales of November. You'll understand what we know and what we never will about why the vessel was lost so suddenly with all hands. You'll know how the Fitzgerald is remembered today and why its story seems certain to live on as a profound mystery and an emblem of the hundreds of boats lost beneath the waves of North America's great unsalted sea. I'm Jay Gabler of the Duluth News Tribune, and this is Edmund Fitzgerald, 50 Years Below.
I can go on my phone right now and get a pretty good idea of what the wave conditions are going to be on Lake Superior 2, 3, 4 days from now. I know that when I started here 20 years ago, none of the boat crew trusted any forecast out beyond about 24 hours. Now, if the forecast says it's going to be bad 4 days from now, we're not going out. And so those sorts of resources didn't exist in the mid-70s, certainly for Lake Superior. And if those models did exist and they were able to predict those waves, undoubtedly different decisions would be made.
That's Jay Austin, a professor of physics and astronomy at the University of Minnesota Duluth. He's one of the people we asked to help us understand what conditions the Edmund Fitzgerald was facing the night it succumbed. In this episode, we'll dive into the question of what ships like the Fitzgerald do on Lake Superior and why it's such a potentially dangerous job. Later, we'll introduce the Fitz itself and talk about why it was a legend long before its loss. The News Tribune is based in Duluth, Minnesota, a city of around 88,000 people on the very western tip of Lake Superior. Duluth is here because of the lake, and it shares a harbor with Superior, Wisconsin. Together, Duluth and Superior make up the Twin Ports. Superior is where the Fitzgerald began its last voyage, which would end with its sinking at the opposite end of the lake. In Superior, the Fitz loaded up with 26,116 long tons of taconite pellets. If you're from around here, you know what a taconite pellet is. You can't miss the mountains of them piled up near the harbor, and they have even been sold in gift shops for visitors who want to take home a souvenir of the Twin Ports' industrial might. Here's Kaylee Matuzak of the Lake Superior Maritime Visitor Center.
Taconite itself is basically the name of the iron formation. That's the raw thing they take out of the ground. To make an iron ore pellet, you grind that into a fine dust. You demagnetize it, so you take out the magnetic part, that's the useful part, and then you roll it into a little pellet with like bentonite clay, a little bit of limestone, and then that's easier both to melt down in the blast furnaces, easier to load and unload, and easier to transport.
Each pellet is about the size of, well, some shipping insiders actually refer to them as marbles.
You've got 26,000 tons of marbles, give or take, that are rolling down the ship, the taconite pellets.
That's Frederick Stonehouse, author of The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, one of the first comprehensive books about the tragedy. Let's talk a little more about what kind of ship the Fitzgerald was. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald, launched in 1958, was a Great Lakes bulk freighter. We asked Kaylee Matuzak to describe this kind of ship.
The standard older style, you got long boat. You're definitely between 600 to 800 feet long generally, so you can get where you need to go via different locks and rivers. Up at the bow, you'll have the pilot house. You'll have some crew quarters. Pilot house is basically the eyes and ears of the vessel, so that's where they steer the thing. That's where they got radar, radio, all that good stuff. And then on the back aft section, you have the galley. You have more crew quarters, and then you have the engine room and all that jazz. So that's kind of where the power comes from in the vessel.
When we talk about bulk freighters, bulk means the ship is not carrying boxes or containers of anything. Its three holds were just big, empty spaces that were filled with massive amounts of undifferentiated cargo. In the case of the Edmund Fitzgerald, taconite pellets. The dividers between the holds were made of mesh.
It can't be compartmentalized, like was so touted with the Titanic of, how she could have X amount of flooded compartments and she would still be fine. It's like so many of the ships we talk about, especially some of these older ones, is once there's water coming in, a lot of these big ships are just kind of a big, like a warehouse. It's just gonna keep filling up.
That's Tanner Johnson, co-host of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks. Beyond the Breakers has covered stories like a mutiny on a whale ship, battleships lost during wartime, and a massive oil tanker spill. Yet, Johnson acknowledges, even in such extraordinary company, the Fitz stands out as a story of undying interest, especially for people with connections to Lake Superior.
There's that sense of almost sort of like a twisted sense of pride and like, hey, this is what the lakes can do, even to a modern vessel. The Lake Superior never giving up her dead, that whole sort of, thing that, people will reference. But yeah, I think there is that also. It does kind of give you a sense of that, humans can do a lot of stuff, but nature will still, get one over on us occasionally. And, a lot of our stories deal with that kind of thing. But yeah, I think the Fitzgerald is maybe the best example of that.
We're starting with the nature of the Edmund Fitzgerald as a vessel because it's important to understand what those 29 men were doing out on the lake that night. They weren't fighting a war. They weren't hunting a whale. They were doing their jobs. As maritime occupations go, Great Lakes shipping can be dangerous, but it's not like deep-sea welding. The wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald was shocking because to lose a ship like that is rare. In fact, a freighter like the Fitzgerald has not been lost again since 1975. A taconite pellet may seem like a small thing to lose your life over, but Great Lakes shipping is important. Roger Lalivra is the editor of Know Your Ships, the standard reference guide to freighters plying the Great Lakes. We caught up with him at a conference.
What I really would like to see happen is people become more aware of the importance of Great Lakes shipping in their everyday lives, that they don't realize, perhaps, that the iron ore, the taconite pellets to make the steel, to make your car, your refrigerator, your whatever probably got carried by a Great Lakes freighter. The salt on your roads in the winter, quite possibly moved by Great Lakes freighter. The materials, the concrete, the limestone, the products, the aggregates to build your roads, quite possibly came by a Great Lakes freighter. Even your cereal, the grain may have gone. You have General Mills cereal, big elevator down in Buffalo, New York. That probably came by freighter. Same with Toledo. So there's a lot of what you do every day in your everyday life that comes via freighter in some way or another.
Iron ore mined in Minnesota and shipped through the Great Lakes has been used to build some of America's most iconic skyscrapers and to build our military's tanks, ships, and planes.
If it had not been for the Great Lakes shipping infrastructure that was in place, to be able to move those raw materials down to the mills, steel mills on the lower lakes, through the heavily defended Sioux locks during World War II, that we may not have won the war.
The Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum is located on Whitefish Point, for good reason. Many vessels have been lost near where the Fitzgerald went down. Here's Bruce Lynn, the museum's director, on the larger significance of the maritime activity that led to those wrecks.
We shouldn't really think about them as just being isolated and, oh gosh, these were, this was a ship that might have been hauling something and that crew was at the wrong place at the wrong time. Well, maybe in some of the cases that might have been the situation, but they were part of a broader piece of machinery or a broader machinery that was building our country at the same time. You had people moving westward on the Great Lakes, so often these ships would be loaded up with immigrants that were settling in different parts of Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota. They might have been heading west, right, on board those ships, but at the same time, those ships returned, they were loaded up with bulk cargoes and what have you. So this was a vital part, this Great Lakes shipping and everything that went along with it, from the light stations to the life-saving service stations to ultimately the Coast Guard stations to these cities that were being built around some of the shipping. It is really a page out of the history of the United States in the building of the country. So I think it's always important to kind of keep it in that context, because I think it's easy to forget that and we get wrapped up in the ship. What did the ship look like, or what kind of a ship was it? And sometimes the crew of that ship, whatever that ship may be, almost not always, but at times can take a backseat to the ship itself or the story, those final moments. Again, going back to the Fitzgerald, they were all crew, they all had families, and they were all part of this broader part of our history.
Talk to people who live on the Great Lakes and you'll hear a common refrain. These boats are like family. Here's Roger LaLivra again.
My family's roots run deep on the Great Lakes, especially on the St. Mary's River. And I grew up watching the boats go by. Boats like the Edmund Fitzgerald, they came by a couple of times every week. They're familiar names. They're kind of like family. There's the Edmund Fitzgerald. Oh, there's the Anderson. There's the such and such. You see them all the time. And so you're just familiar with them.
For the crew of these vessels, the work pays fairly well, although, at least in 1975, you could earn more working in an automotive plant than on an ore carrier. On a freighter, though, you're out on the Great Lakes. The work is meaningful, and on a good day, it's fairly routine. Of course, it does involve riding an extremely heavy vessel across the surface of a lake that can be treacherous. Here's Jay Austin, the UMD professor, talking about just why Lake Superior can be so dangerous.
The thing that is interesting about a lake being large is that the wind has an opportunity to build waves over time, whereas in a smaller lake, there's just not as much room for those waves to develop. And so you end up with a very, very different climate than you would on a smaller lake. Lake Superior sits a lot further north than the other Great Lakes. I mean, you don't think about it until you look at a map, and Superior is just really displaced to the north compared to the other Great Lakes. And that provides a colder and stormier climate.
If you've heard anyone talk about Lake Superior, you've probably heard that it's the world's largest freshwater lake by surface area. Jay Austin pointed out that when it comes to wave development, that surface size really matters.
It's the deepest of the Laurentian Great Lakes, and that large surface area means that waves can build over a very, very long time.
Bulk freighters like the Edmund Fitzgerald generally aren't designed for glamour, but they are striking by sheer virtue of their size. Duluth is very much a tourist town, among other things, and the city's showcase attraction is the Duluth Ship Canal, where people gather to watch boats of all kinds, but particularly bulk freighters, pass beneath the aerial lift bridge as they enter or exit Duluth Harbor. The freighters tower above people standing on the piers, and at hundreds of feet long, an ore carrier is like the Star Destroyer in the opening shot of Star Wars. It seems to keep going and going and going. On November 9th, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald did not pass under the lift bridge as it left the harbor. Since the Fitzgerald loaded up at the Eloise docks in Superior, the freighter left through the Superior entry on the harbor's south side, the harbor's natural entrance between Minnesota Point and Wisconsin Point. Let's talk about the origins of the Edmund Fitzgerald. We should start by acknowledging that since this is a newspaper podcast, we're going to follow Associated Press style and use the pronoun it when discussing the Fitzgerald or any other vessel. Maritime tradition, of course, designates a vessel as her. Gordon Lightfoot sang of the Edmund Fitzgerald as the pride of the American side. That's in contrast to the other side of the Great Lakes, the Canadian side. When you're talking about freighters on Lake Superior, you're typically talking about two different types of vessels. Here's Kaylee Matuzak.
Well, a laker would be anything that is only operating on the Great Lakes. Technically, a laker, if it's small enough, could go out through the seaway, but they're generally not going to. Pretty freshwater bound for the contracts they have and the things they need to do. Salties are the ships that are coming from overseas that have the big sharp noses and the bulbous bows, usually got the cranes on them. They're working from anywhere in the world, coming down the seaway to deliver stuff or take stuff out.
Among the lakers, there are U.S.-flagged ships and Canadian-flagged ships. The Edmund Fitzgerald was a U.S.-flagged laker, and when it was built, it was the largest ship on the Great Lakes, the pride of the American side.
There was 4 ships that were called Fitzgerald over time. So it was the 4th they were on the seas for 105 years. There was a Fitzgerald ship. And it was, when it was built, it was the biggest one. With cargo, it made all kinds of records and carrying cargo and, millions, making them fast, how many trips they had and stuff like that. So it was like a Titanic of the Great Lakes.
That's L. Andrew Warner, author of Edmund Fitzgerald, The Legendary Great Lakes Shipwreck, pointing out that the Edmund Fitzgerald was part of a long legacy. That was also true of the ship's namesake. Here's Paul Sabrin, curator at the Museum Ship Valley Camp in Sault Ste. Marie, giving a tour of that museum's Edmund Fitzgerald exhibits.
She was christened as the SS. SS is not Secret Service, but it is steamship. This Edmund Fitzgerald, and it's not Edmund with an O, it's Edmund with a U. Fitzgerald, and the Fitzgerald family basically were numerous uncles, grandparents that were captain and Navy people, maritime people. But Edmund, he was a chairman of the board of the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company.
Edmund Fitzgerald's family had a rich history on the Great Lakes. His great-grandparents immigrated from Ireland and settled in Michigan. Here's L. Andrew Warner.
They came from Ireland and had 12 children, I think. 6 sons. All 6 sons became captains on the Great Lakes. Then they got into shipbuilding, and of course they named the ships after themselves too. First one was E. Fitzgerald, but it was for Edmund Fitzgerald. And then there was the R.E. Fitzgerald, and then there's W.E. Fitzgerald, and then of course the Edmund Fitzgerald. And there's been no Fitzgeralds after that.
Edmund Fitzgerald, spelled E-D-M-U-N-D, had a great uncle who was also named Edmund Fitzgerald, but spelled with an O instead of a U. E-D-M-O-N-D. That elder Edmund Fitzgerald was the namesake of a ship called the E. Fitzgerald, lost with all hands during a Lake Erie storm in November 1883. Okay, but why would a Great Lakes freighter be named after a life insurance executive? Because life insurance companies have a lot of money to invest, and given his family's maritime involvement, Edmund Fitzgerald, namesake of the ship we're talking about, energetically led his company to become a major investor in Great Lakes commerce. Eventually, just as Edmund Fitzgerald stepped down as president, the company launched its own boat. The boat was named in Fitzgerald's honor, against his own wishes. He wanted to name it something like Milwaukee, where the insurance company was based. The board outvoted him, but the Edmund Fitzgerald would still carry the word Milwaukee on its stern due to its owner being based there. The Edmund Fitzgerald was built by the Great Lakes Engineering Works in River Rouge, Michigan, designed to do exactly what it was doing on the night it sank: carry Minnesota taconite to Detroit steel mills. It actually visited its registered home port of Milwaukee only once, when it docked there for 3 months in 1959 during a steelworkers strike. In a headline about the boat's impending launch, the Detroit Free Press referred to the Edmund Fitzgerald as a, quote, Lakes Giant. A month before the launch, Michigan's Escanaba Daily Press posited that, quote, perhaps no larger ever will be built. That didn't prove true, but the Edmund Fitzgerald was king of the Great Lakes for nearly 15 years. Here's Frederick Stonehouse.
She was the flagship of the Y, quite literally, of Columbia Transportation Division, Ogilvy Norton Corporation. And she was the largest freighter for several years on the Great Lakes until the 1,000-footer came along, the Stewart Court. I think she came out in 71, maybe early 72. Then she took the reins of that honor. But other than that, it was the Fitz.
Let's break that down. The Fitzgerald was owned by the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, but sailed in the fleet of the Cleveland-based Ogilvy Norton Company. It was leased to that company's Columbia Transportation Division, which had a logo with a C inside a star, as seen on the Edmund Fitzgerald smokestack. Like all Lakers, and more so than most of its era, the Edmund Fitzgerald was long. It was 75 feet wide and 729 feet long, meaning that it was nearly 10 times as long as it was wide. For comparison, a standard Crayola crayon is 12 times as long as it is wide. So break off the tip of a crayon and the rest of the crayon comes pretty close to the dimensions of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Another analogy for the dimensions of a ship like the Fitzgerald comes from journalist Porter Fox, who calls Great Lakes freighters, quote, moving skyscrapers. Why was the Fitzgerald 729 feet long? That number is not random. The St. Lawrence Seaway connecting the Great Lakes to the Atlantic was built for ships of a maximum length of exactly 729 feet. Although the Fitzgerald wasn't intended to be ocean-going, the MacArthur Lock in Sault Ste. Marie wasn't much more generous, accommodating vessels at a maximum length of 730 feet. The Fitzgerald was built as long as it possibly could have been. Here's L. Andrew Warner.
The other thing, too, that was different about this one for mariners, not maybe so much for the public, it was not built in one piece. It was the first ship to be built in pieces, the hull, and then a big crane put it together. So it was the first one to have that happen, too.
In building the Edmund Fitzgerald, the Great Lakes Engineering Works employed a joint weld-rivet method, rather than simply using rivets, as had been done in the past. Welds were not as sturdy as rivets, but they were lighter. Instead of all those rivets and joiner plates, the Fitzgerald could carry more cargo. You may be starting to pick up a theme here. At the bow, or front, of the Fitzgerald was a raised pilot house, and at its stern, or rear, was another raised section containing the ship's engine room and galley. All along the ship's long, largely flat main deck were hatches leading to the cargo holds. Those hatches would become a subject of intense scrutiny after the ship was lost. So would the ballast tanks, which ran along both sides of the ship between the outer hull and the cargo holds. In a freighter like the Fitzgerald, ballast tanks are pumped full of water when the holds aren't completely full to balance and stabilize the boat. When the holds are full of cargo, as they were when the Fitzgerald sank, the ballast tanks are left empty, since the last thing a vessel needs under those conditions is the weight of additional water. Ore freighters are not the flashiest vessels on the world's waterways, but by Laker standards, the Fitz was ritzy. The boat had sleek lines and a clean red and white color scheme. The line expected to host VIPs on its flagship vessel, and accordingly, the interior was done in high style. Detroit's J.L. Hudson Company was hired to trick the ship out with flourishes like leather swivel chairs and deep pile carpeting. There was air conditioning, even for the crew. Here's Bruce Lynn.
When it was launched, it was the largest ship on the Great Lakes. It was the queen of the lakes. It was, to use Gordon Lightfoot's lyrics, it was the pride of the American side. I mean, this ship was a step above. It was the flagship of the Columbia Transportation Division. There were so many things that made this a special ship. It was a record-breaking ship. It had the finest, really for the most part, likely the finest appointments of if you were a crewman or if you were a passenger, there's someone that might be fortunate to actually go on board the ship. If you were a VIP with the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company that owned the ship, or if you had a connection with the Ogilvy Norton Company, or if you just knew the right person.
It's still true that a ride on a Great Lakes freighter is an experience you can't buy. Offering VIPs a ride on the Edmund Fitzgerald was a way for the ship's operator to leave a big impression on people like, for example, potential clients. The crew members even, obligingly, sent passengers home with Polaroid pictures to show off just how cool they were to have snagged a ride on the pride of the American side. If life on the lake ever got boring, no worry. The Edmund Fitzgerald had TV sets, so passengers and off-duty crew could watch Gunsmoke and The Price is Right. The Edmund Fitzgerald was officially launched on June 7, 1958. The weather was perfect. Here's Alandra Warner.
15,000 people were at the launch, and all kinds of dignitaries, and there was planes flying overhead. There was flotilla of ships that were welcoming it, including the one still W.E. Fitzgerald that was still on the lake at the time. And so it was a big deal in Detroit. And there's some of the omens, they talk about what happened with it.
In retrospect, the boat's launch would be seen as full of bad omens, as Museum Ship Valley Camp curator Paul Sabrin points out on his tours.
Mr. Fitzgerald was there. So Mrs. Fitzgerald then grabbing the champagne bottle. Okay, on this occasion, I do announce the launch of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Boy, wait over, it bounced back. Okay, let's try it again. Then, boy, wait over, it bounced back. Finally, the third time, the champagne bottle pretty much was broken in. It was the launch.
Here's Alandra Warner again.
When it was launched, it slid sideways into the water. So there was a huge splash that went on the crowd, and they got wet, and one guy had a heart attack and died.
The news of the death was appended as a final paragraph to an Associated Press story about the launch.
The Fitzgerald will be able to carry 26,000 gross tons of iron ore and has a top speed of 16 miles an hour. A Toledo man, 58-year-old Jennings Frazier, was stricken by a heart attack as he watched the launching and died at the scene. The Grand Rapids Press, June 9th, 1958.
Once the Fitzgerald was finally launched, though, it shone. When the Fitz went on its maiden voyage, it made front-page news in port towns the boat merely passed by. Its first duty was to take on 20,000 tons of, you guessed it, taconite, which it loaded in Silver Bay, Minnesota on September 24th, 1958. Less than 2 years later, it was back at Silver Bay to load a record cargo of 22,475 tons of iron ore. In 1964, the Fitzgerald became the first Great Lakes freighter to carry more than 1 million long tons of ore in a single season. In the era before 1,000-footers, ships over 700 feet long were considered super lakers, a term routinely used to describe the Edmund Fitzgerald. When the Fitz made headlines in 1968 as the first vessel to leave Duluth during that year's shipping season, the News Tribune called the Fitz, quote, "Granddaddy of the United States Great Lakes Fleet when it comes to carrying record ore cargoes." Here's Frederick Stonehouse.
She set a number of speed and cargo records on her typical haul coming down from two harbors into Toledo. It was run-of-the-mill. Again, crew took a lot of pride in her. She was indeed, but she wasn't really that different than any of the lake boats that were on the lake at the time.
To the average person watching a vessel pass through Duluth or Sault Ste. Marie, an ore carrier is an ore carrier. They might not know unless they're told that a vessel might be the largest on the lakes or have a unique history. Even to people who didn't know much about the industry, though, the Fitzgerald was a celebrity among ships. Here's Bruce Lynn.
The Fitzgerald just had so many things that made it kind of a standout, a star, really, so to speak, among ships that were operating in the lake. Boat nerds loved taking pictures of this thing. It was one of the prettier ships. Even the captains, there were only 4 of the captains, but one of them, Peter Pulser, was a showman, really. They'd be going through the Soo Locks, and he would have the radios blaring with music or the Tigers game or what have you. And he connected with people when they were going through the locks. So it was a familiar, relatively new ship. It was a huge ship. When it was launched, it was called by the Detroit News, or one of the Detroit newspapers, the largest man-made object dropped into fresh water.
In 1969, the News Tribune wrote that the Fitzgerald, quote, "is making a habit of continually breaking all-time records for hauling ore cargoes." In retrospect, though, it seems ominous that immediately below that statement, the paper noted that vessels including the Fitzgerald were being allowed deeper draft limits. That is, they were being allowed to take on more cargo and ride lower in the water. Here's what the paper said.
One recent development that helps the ore fleet meet the ore demands is U.S. Coast Guard authorization of deeper draft limits for newer vessels. Most Lakers built or converted for lake service since 1949 have been granted increases, and reports say vessel operators wasted no time in painting new plimsoll marks on these boats to take advantage of the ruling. The value of this new ruling can be imagined when considering that a boat can load an additional 100 tons of cargo for every extra inch of draft permitted. Duluth News Tribune, August 17, 1969.
Not only was the Fitzgerald big, it was fast. In fact, just a year before the ship sank, it was slapped with a speeding ticket in Windsor, Ontario. Here's a report from the Windsor Star as it appeared in an article that also detailed offenses by a gas station vandal, several drunk drivers, and a 20-year-old caught in possession of LSD.
A speeding offense by a ship in the port of Windsor on November 18th resulted in a $150 fine levied against the Columbia Transportation Division of the Ogilvy Norton Company in Cleveland, Ohio. The ship, Edmund Fitzgerald, was found to be traveling at 13 statute miles per hour. The speed limit for the vessel is 10 statute miles per hour. The Windsor Star, January 13th, 1975.
People on the Great Lakes were proud of the Edmund Fitzgerald because it was a symbol of the success of the maritime industry that helped the region thrive in the 20th century. In the 1950s and 1960s, Great Lakes shipping had swagger, and guests enjoying clam digger punch on the Edmund Fitzgerald must have felt like they were on top of the world. In 1970, the Toledo Blade reported on just how comfortable life was for guests on board the Fitzgerald.
The VIP treatment provided for guests on this ore carrier is better than one can imagine at any location ashore. There would be a list of persons a mile long waiting to take this trip if Ogilvy Norton ever gave the opportunity to the public on a paying basis. As a Washington, D.C. passenger wrote in 1966, quote, "When death's dark door I ferry o'er, a day that surely shall come. From heaven itself, I'll ask no more than an Edmund Fitzgerald welcome." End quote. Toledo Blade, November 8th, 1970.
L. Andrew Warner spoke with Pam Johnson, the daughter of Edmund Fitzgerald's steward, Robert Rafferty.
She filled me in on a lot of what the crew and that was. And that was one of her things when I asked her, I said, so what do you want the public to remember about the crew and the ship? And she said, or about the ship. And she said, I want them to know it was a good crew. And I want them to know the Fitzgerald was a good ship.
In the next episode, we'll learn more about who was on the Edmund Fitzgerald in November 1975. And we'll learn why they decided to set out on the season's last ore run, even when a storm was brewing. Edmund Fitzgerald, 50 Years Below, is a production of the Duluth News Tribune. This podcast is written and narrated by Jay Gabler, with audio engineering by Wyatt Buckner and Dan Williamson. The audio of this episode was edited by Wyatt Buckner. Our editors on this project are Katie Roman and Barrett Chase, and our executive editor is Rick Lubbers. Original score composed by William Brueggemann. Newspaper archive excerpts were read by Terry Caddo, Barrett Chase, and Dan Williamson. Thanks to our guests on this episode: L. Andrew Warner, Jay Austin, Tanner Johnson, Roger LaLivra, Bruce Lynn, Kaylee Matuzak, Paul Sabrin, and Frederick Stonehouse. Read more stories about the Edmund Fitzgerald and learn more about this podcast at DuluthNewsTribune.com.
We only won a radar up to, well, we started getting a lot of sea return probably around between 8 and 9 miles, and when he got in the sea return, we turned the other radar on, and we really wasn't sure of any definite target after that.
When the Edmund Fitzgerald sailed out of the Duluth Superior Harbor on November 9, 1975, The weather was pleasant.
If you were there in 1975 on November the 9th, you probably may have been on the golf course. It was that kind of a nice weather for November, but there was a storm brewing up further down south, and it was possible, according to the forecast, that it would hit the bottom part of Lake Superior or the upper Michigan.
When the Fitzgerald left Superior, it was a nice day. I knew there was a storm coming up, but there's storms all the time on Lake Superior.
Those were the voices of Paul Sabrin and L. Andra Warner, two of the experts we asked to help us understand what was the Edmund Fitzgerald doing out there on November 10th, steaming desperately for Whitefish Bay in the worst weather its captain had ever experienced. In the last episode, we talked about Great Lakes shipping and how the Edmund Fitzgerald spent its record-breaking career as the pride of the American side. In this episode, we'll talk about the circumstances of the Lakers' last voyage. Who was on the boat? What did they know about the weather they might be facing on their way to Detroit? What was the condition of the vessel? Was there anything that might conceivably have been done to avoid the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald? I'm Jay Gabler of the Duluth News Tribune, and this is Edmund Fitzgerald, 50 Years Below. Before its final voyage, the Edmund Fitzgerald loaded up at ore docks near Aloys Bay in Superior, Wisconsin. That was unusual for the Fitzgerald, which had earned the nickname the Toledo Express for its typical route from Silver Bay, Minnesota to Toledo, Ohio. Even back in 1975, the Superior docks had a history stretching back over 8 decades. The first dock there was made of wood and opened in 1892 under the auspices of the Duluth and Winnipeg Railroad. In the 1960s, the Great Northern Railway made Dock Number 1 its first taconite dock. By 1975, the Great Northern Railway had become part of Burlington Northern, which carried the Iron Range taconite that filled the Edmund Fitzgerald on November 9th. Here's Kaylee Matuzak of the Lake Superior Maritime Visitor Center in Duluth, explaining how Lakers like the Fitzgerald were loaded at Dock Number 1.
So in Superior at the docks over at BNSF where the Fitzgerald would have been loading that specific day, it's all gravity fed, so the ore pellets are basically charged into the dock. They have chutes that come down and go over the openings to the cargo holds, the hatches, and then they can fill up the ship that way. There's also conveyor belt loading. Silver Bay had that at the time, but Superior did not. And then for unloading, basically the Fitzgerald didn't have a self-unloader like a lot of the ships have today, like the Anderson has today. So it would have been Hewletts, which are basically huge jaws that go over the cargo hold openings for the hatches, go down, take a big bite of the iron ore pellets, and then move them out. So very slow process, but not as slow as doing it by hand, which they had to do back in the day.
Like with shovels?
Yeah, late 1800s shovels. Ships were smaller though, so it wasn't as much of a headache, but it was still probably a huge headache.
Dock Number 1 was retired in 1988, and although it still stands, it is no longer considered safe to visit. All taconite that comes to the Aloys facility today goes to Dock Number 5, which came online in 1977 and was designed to serve the 1,000-foot vessels that took pride of place from the Fitzgerald-sized ships once known as Super Lakers. The Edmund Fitzgerald's final run was intended to be its last of the season. The planned 2-day run would take the boat east across Lake Superior through the Sioux Locks and down to the National Steel Dock at Zug Island in Detroit. After unloading its cargo, the Fitzgerald would continue on to Toledo, where it would likely spend the winter and receive some needed repairs. It was also going to be the last run for Captain Ernest McSorley, who planned to retire after the voyage. Here's John Bacon, author of the newest book about the Edmund Fitzgerald, The Gales of November.
Obviously, he was the best captain on the Great Lakes. Everyone keeps on saying this from other ships, other places, including guys who served with him. Also, a fundamentally decent man, a deeply decent man, in a way that was not flashy. But the story of Craig Sullivan, how he held up the ship to let a cadet get back on when he didn't have to do that at some personal risk for the company, of course. And of course, hard-charging guy. He was paid to deliver, and so that's what he did. I also learned only in the last year and a half, maybe 2, about his last trip to the incentive for it is a bit of a tack-on trip to pay for his wife's health care. How does that not, I mean, it's heartbreaking, undeniable. The whole thing's heartbreaking, but that makes it more so. This guy was a decent man trying to do a decent thing. And all this together, I hate to use the term perfect storm, but it applies here.
Gordon Lightfoot wasn't wrong when he called the ship's captain well-seasoned. Ernest M. McSorley was 63 years old in November 1975, and after 45 years of maritime work, he was ready to retire and spend time with his beloved wife, Nellie, who at the time was in poor health.
Captain McSorley had decades of experience. So, people like to always blame the captain, but he had decades of experience.
That's author L. Andrew Warner. McSorley, the boat's fourth captain, wasn't a showman like his predecessor, Peter Pulser. Pulser was constantly in the news.
The largest cargo of iron ore ever to go through the Sault Ste. Marie lock system will head into the MacArthur Lock in the Michigan Sioux sometime today. A spokesman for the United States Army Corps of Engineers this morning said that the freighter, Edmund Fitzgerald, will be carrying 30,800 tons, a record cargo. The previous record, 29,689 tons, was set by the same ship on its previous trip down the lakes, the spokesman said. Its captain, Peter Pulser, has been shooting for the 30,000 mark for years. He likes a lot of ballyhoo, this fellow. The Sioux Star, July 25th, 1968.
Captain Peter Pulser bosses one of the biggest single pieces of machinery in the Midwest. He is master of the record-breaking Great Lakes ore carrier, Edmund Fitzgerald. So what does a man qualified to run the marvelous Fitzgerald do for a hobby? Build model ships? Or perhaps radios? Or miniature engines? Not on your life. Captain Pulser is maintaining his reputation as a floating amateur disc jockey. When Pulser took command of the new Fitzgerald, he had a large electronic bullhorn erected atop the pilot house. It was fitted with a microphone and a recording console on the bridge of the mighty steamer. He plays music when passing tourist camps on the shores of the St. Mary's River. When the vessel passes within 100 feet of shore and in the early morning, Pulser often will wake the tourists with music and tell them to start their day. Benton Harbor News Palladium, November 20th, 1969.
Wondering if Captain Peter Pulser takes requests? He's the music-loving skipper on the big ore carrier Edmund Fitzgerald, who has the stereo set in his cabin hooked up to the ship's loudspeaker. The music and a few words of greeting are played for the benefit of landlubbers every time the freighter transits the St. Mary's, St. Clair, and Detroit rivers. Duluth News Tribune, February 1st, 1970.
By contrast, the same newspaper archive sources that turn up a pile of stories about Captain Pulser reveal no stories about Captain McSorley on the Edmund Fitzgerald until, tragically, November 1975. Even in the decades before Ernest McSorley took command of the Fitzgerald in 1972, he rarely made the news. Here's one exception from the Cleveland Press 9 years before the Edmund Fitzgerald launched.
Columbia Transportation Company has been advised by the U.S. Maritime Service Institute of Sheepshead Bay, New York, that Captain James M. Guggenheimer of the steamer Wolverine was the first member of this fleet to complete the correspondence course in radar for deck personnel. Likewise, Columbia is believed to be the first fleet in the Great Lakes area to subscribe to the course. Closely following Captain Guggenheimer across the finish line were 3 officers of Columbia's steamer France. They are Captain Bert Lamberts, Ernest M. McSorley, first mate, and Ronald M. Hansen, third mate. The Cleveland Press, August 2nd, 1949.
The responsible, respected McSorley definitely was not looking for ballyhoo. If you're a Star Trek fan, you might say that Peter Pulser was more of a Captain Kirk, while Ernest McSorley was more of a Captain Picard. If the Fitzgerald had started dropping out of the headlines, though, that's also because by the time McSorley took charge in 1972, it wasn't the King of the Lakers anymore. It was hundreds of feet shorter than the new 1,000-foot vessel Stuart J. Court, and although the Fitzgerald was expected to spend at least another 30 years on the Great Lakes, it was starting to show its age. For all that we don't know about the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, we know a lot about the condition the ship was in on its final run. That's because the vessel's spar deck, or main deck, was actually inspected on October 31st, 1975. Yes, Halloween, just 10 days before it went down. Here's L. Andrew Warner.
It had been at the end of October before it went out. an inspection to see if it was seaworthy. And then we were talking November, of course. So at the end of October, they found 4 vents that were not properly closing. And they said the Fitzgerald could not sail again until next season they get all that fixed. But they would let them go this time. So that was their last voyage before next year they would have had to fix all that before they got on the water.
The October 31st inspection was a routine part of a regimen designed to take account of any issues with infrastructure, including the massive hatches covering the cargo holds. The inspection happened while the Fitzgerald was unloading in Toledo, so the inspector could take a close look at the hatches while they were open as well as closed. Laker hatches take a lot of wear and tear during service, so it's understandable that they are a focus of safety inspections. The Fitzgerald inspection results, as detailed in a Coast Guard report following the ship's loss, found a number of issues.
The October 31st inspection disclosed discrepancies at number 13 hatch, number 15 hatch, number 16 hatch, and at number 21 hatch. The discrepancy in number 13 hatch was a notch, less than 1 inch in depth, in the inboard edge of the spar deck inner stringer on the port side of the hatch opening, approximately 3 feet aft of the forward combing. The discrepancy in the number 15 hatch was a gouge less than 1 inch in depth in the inboard edge of the spar deck inner stringer on the port side of the hatch opening, approximately 3 feet aft of the forward combing. The discrepancy in number 16 hatch consisted of an indentation and a crack in the port hatch girder. The discrepancy in number 21 hatch was a crack in the weld at the intersection of the hatch combing and the hatch end girder on the starboard side, aft. This crack was approximately 1 inch in length. Both the Coast Guard inspector and the ABS surveyor testified that they believed that these 4 discrepancies were typical of damage noted on other ore carriers where dockside offloading equipment was used. U.S. Coast Guard Marine Casualty Report, July 26, 1977.
So, not great, but given that we're talking about a 729-foot ship, you can see where a little crack here and a gouge there might not seem that concerning. The Fitzgerald was cleared to proceed until the end of the 1975 shipping season. The boat had taken a few more dings over the years, including a 1969 grounding near the Soo Locks, a 1970 collision with another bulk carrier, and 3 occasions in the early 1970s when the Fitzgerald bumped into the Soo Locks walls. In September 1974, the crew accidentally started to open a hatch cover before releasing all the clamps that held it shut. The clamps were damaged and later repaired. None of this was that far out of the ordinary for a busy freighter like the Fitzgerald, but it would all seem ominous given what happened on November 10, 1975. Were there problems with the hatches that led to the ship's loss? We'll look much more closely at that question in coming episodes, but right now let's talk about the crew members who were responsible for the ship. As Frederick Stonehouse points out, referencing Captain McSorley and First Mate John McCarthy, for the average person who knows the story of the Fitzgerald, its crew members and their families are essentially faceless.
Yeah, one of the things we often blow by on the Fitzgerald every year is the families. We just kind of forget about them. They were part of the story when the ship went down, and now every year that passes, they just seem to fade away a little deeper and become less of the issue and really less of the focus. And the same thing with the crewmen. We remember the Captain McSorley when we kind of remember McCarthy, and then we kind of fade off from there as they slide on out of our sight. And reality, again, they should be part of this focus. They should be remembered for what they do and how they did it and how they died.
In later episodes, we'll come back to the question of the families and how hard the last 50 years have been for them. For now, let's stay in 1975 and learn more about who the crew members were. In John Bacon's book, The Gales of November, he breaks down the crew list by role. As the author points out, many people, even those close to the tragedy, don't actually know a lot about how 29 men worked together to keep the Fitzgerald humming.
One of the best things I heard was from Deb Champeau. Her dad was Buck Champeau, who was one of the engineers on the ship. She said, I really didn't appreciate, and she's not a teenage girl when he's gone, I didn't really appreciate what my dad did until after he was gone. And I've been gratified even from the family members to hear they actually learned more about what their dads and uncles and cousins and so on did from this book, because it's very hard work. It's, I think, pretty noble work. It's essential work. And as Tanner said, we know the farmer, we know the factory worker, we know the miner. Nobody knows the sailor. And that's where all our stuff comes from.
As Bacon notes in his book, there were 4 officers, including Captain McSorley, 3 of the crew were wheelsmen, the people who actually handled the wheel. 3 were watchmen, who handled duties including lookout and maintenance. 3 were deckhands, utility men, handling a range of tasks. 5 were engineers, maintaining the 7,500 horsepower engine. There were 3 oilers, who did exactly what that job description suggests. 3 crew members were tasked with wiping and maintenance, including taking care of the trash, which Lakers had only recently at that point started incinerating rather than just throwing overboard. Seriously. Then there were 2 porters, 2 cooks, and a cadet, a sailor in training. Cadet David Cowboy Weiss was one of the youngest crew members, along with 21-year-old deckhand Mark Thomas. Weiss was also the only Californian on board the Edmund Fitzgerald. The 1971 high school graduate had been working at a local pet kennel before leaving to study at the Great Lakes Maritime Academy. In 2005, one of Weiss's Maritime Academy classmates, Dean Hobbs, told the Ventura County Star that Weiss earned his nickname, Cowboy, quote, because he liked to wear mirrored shades, a big belt buckle, and a black Stetson. According to his classmate, Weiss became hooked on Laker life during a visit to Chicago, where he was on Navy Pier when he saw a freighter passing by and thought that might be, quote, the life for him. Captain McSorley was the oldest man on the Fitzgerald, but there were 4 more crew members in their 60s. One of them was 62-year-old Bob Rafferty, the steward. In other words, the cook. Although Gordon Lightfoot didn't name any names in his song The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, a man referred to as, quote, the old cook is the only person to have direct quotes in the song. Quote, fellas, it's too rough to feed ya. And then, quote, fellas, it's been good to know ya. Remembered as a jovial man, Rafferty had only been on the Fitzgerald since October 1975, so recently that his stepson later said he didn't realize his stepfather was on the ship when news broke about its loss. The stepson said he and other family members, quote, kept waiting and waiting for the good news that Rafferty was safe. It never came. In 2000, Rafferty's daughter told the Wichita Eagle she thought her dad would love Lightfoot's song, although the cultural ubiquity of the Edmund Fitzgerald was sometimes hard. When a coworker jokingly referred to something as having, quote, sunk like the Edmund Fitzgerald, she had to tell him quietly, my dad was on that ship. Bruce Lynn, director of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, said the museum has been working to personalize the crew's stories.
We have a scrolling video that shows pictures of every single one of the crew members. And when I started, we didn't really have that. We had a list of names, and a lot of us thought we had pictures of most of the crew members, but let's see if we can't get pictures of all the crew members. And that took a little while. But then it's also part of this video now where we have scenes of the ship when it was sailing, clearly happier days when it was being launched. But then, intermixed with that, we have pictures of the crewman itself. So I think many, if not all, the Fitzgerald family members have come to truly appreciate keeping that memory alive of their loved ones. Let's say there's one crewman and we have 6 or 7 family members at a memorial ceremony, the one that we do each November. And you hear them starting to talk about, say, a picture of that loved one of theirs, and you might see a car in the background, and you might see a house in the background, and let's say it's Alan Cowman, and he's standing beside that car, and suddenly the rest of the Cowman family starts talking, oh, I remember that was Thanksgiving in 1971. He had just gotten that car. He was so proud of that car. And then they start laughing, and they start talking more and more about who he was as a person. Same way with Bruce Hudson as another example. Bruce Hudson, oddly, he and I we have a few things in common. I went to Ohio State, he was going to Ohio State. I was an avid motorcycle rider, he was into them. I have a Dodge Challenger, he had a Dodge Challenger. Unfortunately, it was waiting at the dock for him and his crew, and one of his good buddies on the ship, Mark Thomas, they were gonna do a cross-country trip in that Challenger. Little things like that when you talk to either, for example, Bruce's cousin or his mom before she passed away, suddenly that crewman comes alive for us, and we feel like in some ways we get to know them a little bit.
Yes, the Edmund Fitzgerald crew members were all men. Women crew members on Great Lakes freighters, especially outside the galley, were essentially non-existent in 1975, although that would begin to change by the end of the decade. Even today, women remain a small minority of crew members on both Lakers and Salties. Here's Kaylee Matuzak.
There's definitely more women working on Lakers today. Still not like a whole heck of a lot, but especially like on the Canadian side, like I think they have a couple female captains. There's definitely women working on most of the freighters that we see coming in and out. Yeah, so I mean, the general politics of the 70s will probably tell you why there weren't women working in too many of those manual jobs. But yeah, there definitely are more nowadays.
Author L. Andrew Warner's father was not on the Edmund Fitzgerald, but growing up with him taught her something about the ways of the maritime trades.
My father was a mariner. He was a chief engineer in Europe, and before we came to Canada. And there's some times you're gone for months at a time, and that takes a special kind of person to do that. You know, you're not seeing your family. You're not having a routine of a normal life. I know one of the times he was gone for about 8 months, and that's a long time. And I think they take the weather that comes. I mean, it's a dangerous thing. Captain Eric Wood, who is mentioned in the book as well, and he says if you go on to the lake, it can be nice and look beautiful, and then there's a huge storm. And if Superior wants to take you, Mother Nature will take you, which means you're to the elements.
On November 9th, 1975, the entire crew was looking forward to the end of the shipping season, a relatively early end given that Lakers would sometimes keep sailing into the new year. They might have been able to catch some R&R in Superior while waiting for the Fitzgerald to load, but they would not have wanted to miss the boat. Here's John Bacon referencing the Arthur M. Anderson, a ship we'll learn more about in the next episode.
The heartbreaking part for me is how happy they were. That the guys on the Anderson, just, as you know, half an hour up the road in Two Harbors. Well, they got 2 months left. They're at the Legion Hall, of course, right there in Two Harbors. But they know they got 2 months left, so they'll tip a few, but they're not going to celebrate anything. The guys on the Edmund Fitzgerald got along unusually well, as you know. They were very close. No real arguments to speak of that anyone can recall who worked for those guys. And they know that because of McSorley's wife, because of repairs that needed to be done, they got 2 days left. This is their last run. This is it. And so they're feeling very good about it, and they got a very unusual 4-month off instead of 2.5 months or so in the winter. They're looking forward to spending that with their families. One guy, Wayne Wilhelm, was going to finally take the engineer's test and try to beat that thing. And the weather was gorgeous. The weather was, you live in Duluth, man. How many November 8ths is it 70 degrees? Not very many. You might not have seen one. So these guys, the weather's beautiful. We're in a great mood. It's been a great season. They broke more of their records, and they've got, 4 months off coming up, and they're saying goodbye to each other, basically. The heartbreaking thing is just how, as I said, it's as good as it gets. And November 8th really was. So, sad stuff.
As Beyond the Breakers podcast co-host Tanner Johnson pointed out, the Fitzgerald crew members were working men who were doing their jobs.
Studying the crew list on the Fitzgerald and, seeing just where these guys were from and just kind of seeing some of the variety and seeing the sort of, it isn't all, just guys from Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan. Obviously, that makes up a good portion of it, but I think there is a surprising variety. And then also, I think the range of ages is always interesting, on the Fitz, like any other vessel. You have guys who are really, really young, guys in their early 20s. Then you've got crew who are all the way up into their 50s and sometimes into their 60s. And I think it gives you an insight into the various sort of reasons that might bring someone to be on the crew of one of these ships, where they are in their lives. Shipwreck enthusiasts, shipwreck nerds, we kind of romanticize, the sea, the lakes, and doing this job. And, kind of like you mentioned earlier, it's not a glamorous job. It's not a job that would be, people would be necessarily lining up to do. It doesn't typically, win you a lot of glory. You might only make the news if something goes wrong. But like anything else, it is a job, and these are humans, and they have, various, attitudes toward what they're doing. And I think it helps to remember that, this is, to us, what is this tragic mystery was a day at work for these guys. No one necessarily wants to go to work thinking that they're going to be immortalized in song, because that probably doesn't bode well for you.
This brings us to the point when Captain McSorley prepared to set out on his scheduled ore run. His last scheduled ore run, even as a storm was brewing. As mentioned at the beginning of this episode, the weather in the Twin Ports was fair. What did Captain McSorley know about the weather he was potentially about to face on the other side of the lake? Here's L. Andrew Warner again.
When the Fitzgerald left Superior, it was a nice day. I knew there was a storm coming up, but there's storms all the time on Lake Superior. And not a concern. These captains, especially Captain McSorley and Captain Cooper of the Anderson, had been through many storms. They knew how to handle them. So, we're aware of it, but not changing anything.
On November 9th, we now know from information that was not available to Captain McSorley, 2 storm systems were converging on the eastern end of Lake Superior. At the time, the National Weather Service was predicting a storm, but nothing out of the ordinary for November on Lake Superior. Captain McSorley really didn't know much more than that. Here's Frederick Stonehouse speaking first about ships in the present day.
Every company or every ship before it departs port, and I believe the day before departure is scheduled, receives a complete weather workup from the Weather Service. Every ship on the lakes. That's how seriously they take it in the commitment of time, and they do a very good job with it. If you were to roll this back to 1913, though, it was even worse. When the total weather forecasting unit was the flag flying at the end of the breakwaters they left on their downbound or upbound trip, they literally had nothing to go on, but quite literally the seam sense of what would be occurring within the forecasting realm. And of course, we know the outcome to that, 250 dead sailors, 47 wrecked ships, and 9 of them being modern freighters. So you could say by Fitzgerald time, they've come a long way, but they had a very long way to go.
If any of the Fitzgerald crew members happened to pick up a copy of the November 9th, 1975 Duluth News Tribune, they would have seen front-page stories about President Gerald Ford's re-election bid, about the shortage of legal aid on the Iron Range, and about how, quote, the metric system of measurement is on the way for the United States. The Sunday newspaper offered weather forecasts for the Twin Ports, northern Minnesota, Minnesota in general, Wisconsin, and Upper Michigan, where the Fitzgerald was headed. Here was the forecast for Upper Michigan.
Occasional rain likely through tonight, turning colder Monday. Lows this morning in low 30s and low 40s. Highs today in mid 40s to near 50. Lows Monday morning in low 30s and low 40s. Highs Monday in upper 30s and mid 40s. Duluth News Tribune, November 9th, 1975.
That was it. Here's University of Minnesota Duluth scientist Jay Austin talking about why Lake Superior storms are so hard to forecast even today.
There can be that sort of strong spatial variability in these systems, which is one of the reasons that we put equipment out. So my lab operates meteorological buoys out on Lake Superior in the Western Arm specifically. And so I work with the Weather Service, and their number one thing is we need more stuff out there because just because you know what the conditions are, near Stony Point doesn't mean you necessarily know what the conditions are in Two Harbors. And so one of the reasons that there are buoys, so the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration operates 3 platforms on Lake Superior. The closest to us is basically just south of Grand Marais. Those platforms only started operating in about 1979 in response to the fact that there wasn't a lot of meteorological data over the lake, which meant it was very difficult to do forecasts. And so really, the Fitzgerald disaster was, in some people's mind, the main impetus behind a better instrumentation or instrumenting Lake Superior and the other Great Lakes better. In fact, there weren't any open lake buoys, to my knowledge, until 1979, 1980, in response to that disaster. And now there are dozens and dozens and dozens, including 3 operated by UMD.
It would have been difficult, even impossible, for Captain McSorley to guess that he was about to steam into the worst storm and the last storm of his life. To the extent he had any indication that a system was brewing, he would not have been inclined to wait it out. As author John Bacon learned while researching his book, even if McSorley wasn't as flashy as Peter Pulser, he wasn't afraid to drive his vessel hard.
Yeah, I knew a bit about the guy. I knew a bit about the story. I had no idea that this was A, the last run of the season, and B, almost certainly his last run, and probably about half a dozen guys on that ship as well. So that obviously raises the stakes quite a bit. That changes, if you're asking for the headspace, that's got to change everything. And I wonder, we can only guess, I wonder if that in some ways he made some uncharacteristic decisions, and not radical ones. He made conservative ones, which he's not known for. And sadly, ironically, perhaps at the exact wrong time. The decision to slow down, the decision to take the northern route, these were utterly uncharacteristic of him. And he'd had his normal hard-charging mindset. I think they get there. I think they get there, frankly, without too much problem.
The captain of a boat works for the shipping company and knows he'll be accountable for the ore that does or does not get moved. Here's Frederick Stonehouse.
I mean, you're the company man. You're the only company man on that boat. Everybody else is a union member, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it does put you in the difficult position of being the sole manager of the vessel.
Anyone who's familiar with Gordon Lightfoot's song remembers how much ore the Fitzgerald was loaded with on November 9th, 1975. David James Carlson leads a Gordon Lightfoot tribute band, and he's had a lot of opportunity to reflect on the significance of that number.
As in the song, it says 26,000 tons more. It weighed 26,000 tons more than the Edmund Fitzgerald weighed empty. 13,000 tons plus was the weight of the Fitzgerald itself. So put them together, you have 40,000 tons buoyantly sailing across the water?
In the last episode, we talked about the fact that the Fitzgerald and other Lakers had been approved to carry increasingly large loads, so the ship sat lower and lower in the water. When we think about the decisions that were made leading up to the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, it's not just about the decision to set out on that run. It's about the decision to load the boat so heavily, even late in the season when the weather is notoriously bad. Freeboard is the distance between the waterline and the ship's deck. Between 1958 and 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald's summertime freeboard requirement didn't change much, from about 12.5 feet to about 11 feet. On the other hand, the wintertime freeboard requirement, which applied in November, was reduced from just shy of 15 feet down to just 11.5 feet. In other words, by 1975, the Fitzgerald was allowed to ride lower in winter than it had originally been allowed to ride in summer. Laker crews learned how to game even the relaxed standards to squeeze more ore on board. This is known as cheating the plimsoll line, or finding ways to manipulate the load to keep the line showing how low the vessel can go, just barely above the water. Here's John Bacon.
And Mark Twain said, you don't develop a bad habit overnight. You get coaxed down the steps to the basement one by one until finally you find yourself on the bottom floor. One of my editors gave me a great line. He said, they're always putting on a few more tons of taconite, a few more tons, which is, he's got to put on, of course, 58 million pounds of stuff. Well, they keep on cheating the plimsoll line, how low you're supposed to go. And of course, the standards change incredibly, more than a yard. That's crazy. And there's no reason for this. The ship was not built for that. That's not these guys' fault. And it's not even cheating a few inches here and there. That's, again, 3 feet plus. It's crazy, but they're going 2 miles over the speed limit and 2 miles more, 2 miles more. At what point is it unsafe? It's so hard to draw that line, literally in this case. And I don't blame the guys. That's what they're supposed to be doing on this thing. And all the other ships are doing the same thing pretty much. But that's one big, literally straws on a camel's back, almost literally. That's one that you see coming and you go, oh no, you're messing with the fates. And then you're doing some other things with the fates and the weather's not good. And we're going to go anyway, and we go too fast. And this is one thing after another after another. You've got all these safety nets that get pulled back one by one by one. And if you had half of them, you'd probably be okay. But you got rid of all of them pretty much. And nature also did that as well. So it's just sad to see the mindset that we got away with it, we're okay. And one of the great lines I got from one of the professors you saw is, you don't know, a shipwreck is a binary occasion, a binary event. You never know how close you are to the edge until you're over it. It's me walking around the blindfold around the Grand Canyon. If I got a blindfold on, I don't know how close I was 2 feet from going over. If I go over, it's all of it. I'm dead. If I walk back, I think that was nothing. Take the blindfold off. And that's what they kept doing.
We asked author Frederick Stonehouse whether there was any possibility that Captain McSorley might have called off the Fitzgerald's final voyage.
Could it, in theory, have happened? Yes. Did it in practicality happen? Of course not, because the ships are there to earn money. They do not earn money sitting in port. So it's the cargo carrying capacity that makes them so valuable. That said, the real culprit here that I think is often not discussed is how abysmally bad the weather forecasting was. This was Neanderthal forecasting via I don't know what, through pigeons with a message tied around their legs. They were doing all the message consolidation in Chicago. So all the forecasting on the Great Lakes ended up in Chicago. They rolled it around, put some pixie dust on it, and eventually sent it to Washington and eventually distributed it to the Lakers. There were some captains that didn't like that because they felt that from a forecasting point of view, it was truly abysmal. So they did their own. And captains like Dudley Paquette on the Winifred Sykes, for example, was famous for doing his own forecasting. And that means getting the facsimiles sent to the ship and him actually doing the workups with time and temperature barometric, what the weather's going to do, and really doing what the forecasters should have been doing. But in their stead, In their defense, the only group that after the Fitzgerald sank really stepped up and said, we have a problem and we can fix it with the Weather Bureau. And today we've got something like the 20 plus weather buoys on the Great Lakes, recording buoys on the Great Lakes. Big ones, small ones, fat ones, skinny ones, all different missions to them, but they really are out there doing their job. Where by contrast, everybody else just kind of threw their hands up and walked away from the Fitzgerald disaster.
At 2:15 p.m. on November 9th, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald departed the Duluth Superior Harbor through the Superior Entry. As the ship sailed east, presses rolled on the next day's Duluth News Tribune with a front-page weather box saying that, quote, winter promises to pack its first punch of the season today. In the next episode, we'll follow the Fitzgerald, accompanied by a ship that's still afloat today, the Arthur M. Anderson, across Lake Superior and into the storm. Edmund Fitzgerald, 50 Years Below is a production of the Duluth News Tribune. This podcast is written and narrated by Jay Gabler, with audio engineering by Wyatt Buckner and Dan Williamson. The audio of this episode was edited by Wyatt Buckner. Our editors on this project are Katie Roman and Barrett Chase, and our executive editor is Rick Lubbers. Original score composed by William Brueggemann. Newspaper archive excerpts and other historical documents were read by Terry Caddo, Barrett Chase, and Dan Williamson. Thanks to our guests on this episode: L. Andra Warner, Jay Austin, John U. Bacon, David James Carlson, Tanner Johnson, Bruce Lynn, Kaylee Machuzak, Paul Sabrin, and Frederick Stonehouse. Read more stories about the Edmund Fitzgerald and learn more about this podcast at DuluthNewsTribune.com.
There were three outbounders that were to keep an eye out for this for the Fitzgerald, and they passed with negative contact. Is that correct?
Roger on that. We tried to call him about 6 or 8 times on emergency FM and emergency FM, and every day, and we cannot reach.
We use the Edmund Fitzgerald shipwreck as a topic for one of our educational programs, and the main point that we want to get through to people is that there were no survivors in this wreck. So sometimes we compare it to the Titanic, which was actively sinking for over 2 hours and had over 700 survivors, versus the Fitzgerald, which only had 29 people and no survivors. So the survivors that were on the Titanic had all this first-hand information about what happened during the shipwreck and could provide information to the people investigating it, whereas there was none of that for the Fitzgerald.
That was Sarah Summers-Liedtke, director of the Lake Superior Maritime Visitor Center. So let's talk about the Titanic, a shipwreck that was very different than the Edmund Fitzgerald. Titanic was lost over 60 years earlier than the Fitzgerald. It was larger than the Fitzgerald, although at 883 feet to the Fitzgerald's 729, not that much longer. Given how different the two shipwrecks were, why bring up the Titanic? Because, thanks to James Cameron's movie and over a century of other plays and books and TV shows, it's the shipwreck most people know most about. For that reason, it's not a bad starting place to try understanding what might have happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald. Fully loaded, arguably overloaded, in November 1975, the Fitzgerald weighed about 40,000 tons. Titanic, fully laden, weighed about 52,000 tons. Why did those massive boats even float in the first place? It's because of their shape. A boat floats as long as it can displace more than its weight in water without becoming submerged. Drop a boat into the water, and once it has displaced its weight in water, it reaches an equilibrium and doesn't sink any farther. Load a floating laker with taconite, and it rests lower in the water, but still, under normal conditions, remains afloat. Once a boat springs a leak, though, that equilibrium doesn't hold. The water comes in and adds to the weight of the boat, which sinks lower. If the water continues to come in, the boat eventually falls entirely below the surface, and that's the end of the story. You might remember the movie dialogue.
But this ship can't sink.
She's made of iron, sir. I assure you, she can, and she will.
We all know why Titanic sank. The ship hit an iceberg, which tore a gash in its hull and let water pour in. The size and design of the ship meant that it took hours for the sea to fully overcome the ship, but eventually it did. One way or another, the Edmund Fitzgerald sank for the same reason. The ship took on water and fell below the surface of Lake Superior. But compared to Titanic, the Fitzgerald sank almost instantly. The two most basic reasons for the difference are the Fitzgerald's design, its deck was much closer to the surface to begin with, and the weather, which was stormy with high waves. Based on Captain McSorley's own statements, we know the Edmund Fitzgerald took on some amount of water before sinking. That leads to the great mystery of the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. How and where did that water get in? How much water got in? Knowing those answers would also address the wreck's most haunting question. Short of never leaving port in the first place, was there anything that anyone could reasonably have done to avoid the catastrophe? In this episode, we'll discuss what we know and what we don't know about what happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald on the night of November 10th, 1975. I'm Jay Gabler of the Duluth News Tribune, and this is Edmund Fitzgerald, 50 Years Below.
When Captain McSorley, Ernie, the old man, took off 26,000 ton of taconite. It wasn't the maximum load. She was capable of 31,000 ton, but she had 26,100 tons of taconite and met up with the Arthur M. Anderson, another ship that is pretty much the same size, same weight, same capacity as the Fitz.
That's Paul Sabrin, curator at the Museum Ship Valley Camp in Sault Ste. Marie, leading a tour of the museum ship's Edmund Fitzgerald exhibit. He mentioned a name that looms large in the story of the Fitzgerald, Arthur M. Anderson. This is the ship that followed the Fitzgerald across Lake Superior, with the Anderson's crew members becoming the last people to see the Edmund Fitzgerald above the waves. Launched in 1952, the Anderson was only 6 years older than the Fitzgerald. At 647 feet, the Anderson was one of those Lakers that was impressive but outdone by the Edmund Fitzgerald when that ship launched and started breaking records. By 1975, though, the Anderson was actually longer than the Fitzgerald, having recently been lengthened by 120 feet. Yes, that's a thing that happens, and something that would very possibly have happened to the Fitzgerald eventually. Here's Kaylee Matuzak of the Lake Superior Maritime Visitor Center.
They don't really do it anymore because anything that would need to be lengthened is either built to spec or it already happened. It's exactly what it sounds like. They take and dry dock a vessel, they cut it in half, they build a new section in the middle part, and then they weld it back together.
The Arthur M. Anderson was leaving Two Harbors, Minnesota, which is about 25 miles northeast of the Twin Ports along the Lake Superior shore. The Anderson left Two Harbors a few hours after the Fitzgerald left Superior, and the two ended up running about parallel to each other, both headed for the Soo Locks on the eastern end of the lake. In many tellings of this story, given the courageous actions the Anderson crew ultimately took in an attempt to aid the Fitzgerald, the two ships and their captains are portrayed as bosom buddies. It doesn't diminish the Anderson's contribution to acknowledge that wasn't exactly the case. The Anderson was captained by Jesse Bernie Cooper, who, like Captain McSorley, had decades of experience on the Great Lakes. The two captains didn't know each other personally, and though they shared a professional respect, in their line of work they were also competitors. Here's John Bacon, author of The Gales of November.
They're definitely competitors, even though the Anderson's going to Gary, Indiana, these guys are going to the island, Detroit. But so what? First guy to the chute, first guy to the Soo Locks. Tell your buddies that. And I think at some point, what became clear to me, it's ingrained. Even when you know better, even when you know there's no real prize this time, whatever else. If you've been competing for 30 or 40 years in the Great Lakes, it's not a switch you turn off. You're going. It's part of your mentality.
On the afternoon of November 9th, the two ships got in contact to discuss the fact that the National Weather Service had just issued a gale warning, predicting that winds on Lake Superior would reach at least 39 miles an hour. That gave the Lakers captains a little more information about what might be coming their way, and they had a choice. They could continue along their present course, which cut pretty straight east across Lake Superior, or they could take the more sheltered northern route, hugging the north shore of Lake Superior. Because it was a longer route, though, it was not a route the Fitzgerald usually took, and in fact the Fitzgerald may not have taken that route any other time that season. Captain Dudley J. Paquette was on a freighter called the Wilfred Sykes that night. By the time the gale warning went out on November 9th, the Wilfred Sykes was close enough to overhear the radio chatter between the Edmund Fitzgerald and the Arthur M. Anderson, and Paquette later described being unsurprised to hear that the two Lakers were continuing on their usual route despite the incoming weather. He decided to play it safer. Here's John Bacon.
He peeled off right away. He peeled off, went to Thunder Bay, Ontario, not Thunder Bay, Michigan. And once you do that, okay, you're gonna get an earful from the company. You're gonna be late, and they're gonna tell you all about it. And as his crew told him, if you're wrong about the storm, you're gonna pay a real price because Cleveland's not gonna like it. And they're right about that. But he did it.
Eventually, Captain McSorley and Captain Cooper agreed and turned north as well. What changed? By 7 p.m. on November 9th, the National Weather Service repeated its warning and said the expected gales would cut across more of the lake than previously realized, producing waves several feet high. Overnight, the gales arrived. By 1 a.m., winds were up to 40 miles per hour, gusting up to 60 miles per hour. How do we know that? The Fitzgerald itself radioed a report, which was routine procedure. With so little information on the lake's changing weather conditions, the Lakers themselves were invaluable sources of information. An hour later, the National Weather Service issued a full-fledged storm warning. As John Bacon points out, what we know now, and the Fitzgerald did not, is that as the Fitzgerald and Anderson were making their way past Isle Royal in northwest Lake Superior, playing it relatively safe, the storm that helped sink the Fitzgerald was tracking east along the southern shore of Lake Superior. Bacon compares the storm's behavior to a catcher in baseball, racing to home plate to block the ship's last sprint to safety. Here's the author trying to imagine Captain McSorley's mindset.
The more I thought about it, the more I thought it through, the more I thought going that route is the right thing to do based on what he knew. And I think it's a noble thing to do in that sense. He's not trying to win. He's not trying to, it's not ego. It's not any bonus. None of that. You're going to lose all those things. So you have to go the slow way. But that comes with hidden risks also. Risks I don't think he fully appreciated perhaps. Of course, it takes you 14 hours longer, which if you don't know and they didn't know, the second storm from the southwest is coming right by you, right across the southern edge of Lake Superior. You just gave that storm 14 hours to get there first. And otherwise, you get there first. We also gave the ship several more hours to fill with water, which otherwise you'd be at Whitefish Bay. You wouldn't be in great shape, but you'd be there and you'd be safe. So those things all added up to, again, for one of the few times in his career, he slowed down at two crucial junctures at the beginning and the end of that trip. And the third thing is he went the northern route, which might have cost him as well. So that is a cruel irony.
On the morning of November 10th, the Fitzgerald and the Anderson turned south to make the final leg of their journey. As they steamed south, it became increasingly clear that the weather was turning not just bad, but very bad. At 7 a.m., Captain McSorley called his bosses in Cleveland to let them know he couldn't say for certain when his vessel would reach the Sioux Locks. Our ETA, he said, is indefinite because of the storms. As the storm grew, the locks would end up closing anyway. By afternoon, the waves were reaching 10 feet. And remember that the Fitzgerald's winter freeboard had been decreased to 11.5 feet. Plus, waves coming from the west were going to be hitting the ship's broadside, exactly what you don't want if you're trying to keep a vessel above water. So what the Fitzgerald was facing was a collision of two systems with rapidly sinking temperature. Here's Alandra Warner.
They have to make the run down to Whitefish Bay, which is the shelter. So they're up on the north shore of Lake Superior, up by Caribou and Mishwakaton Island, and now they have to go straight down. Well, the weather was horrible. The National Weather Service asked all ships to take shelter. Well, when you're in open water on Lake Superior, there ain't no shelter. The gales, the wind had gone to hurricane gale force winds, so they had like a mini hurricane on there. And the wind was going about 100 miles an hour, and it was snowing. So you had, and waves, I mean, that's the big thing is waves. So it was a horrible conditions. McSorley, when he was talking to the Anderson, or to Cooper said it's one of the worst seas he's ever seen. And he'd have been on decades on the water. And they knew what to do. But if your ship is vulnerable, there's only so much you can do. And you're far away from shelter.
Let's back up and talk about how we know what we know about what was happening on the Edmund Fitzgerald as conditions deteriorated throughout the afternoon. We know the weather from a range of sources, including, of course, the Anderson, as well as the other vessels and observation stations in and around Whitefish Bay. The Anderson had the Fitzgerald visible on radar, so it could see where the Fitzgerald was going. Then there were Captain McSorley's radio transmissions. The fact that the Anderson, among other ships, did survive the storm, as terrible as it was, is important to keep in mind. Here's author Frederick Stonehouse.
What was different with Fitzgerald and the rest of the shipping fleet? Because we did have another half dozen Lakers up there. Henry Clay Ford was in the area. The Anderson certainly was there. We had 1, 2, 3, I think, saltwater vessels that were in the area, came through fine. So something was wrong with Fitzgerald, and the question was what that something was.
Throughout the afternoon of November 10th, there were increasing indications that the Fitzgerald was in distress. McSorley described the ship, quote, rolling some, which seems ominous in retrospect, since of course the ship was rolling, it was in a storm. The fact that McSorley mentioned it out loud indicates that it was particularly noticeable. Right at mid-afternoon, just as the storm was really starting to unleash its full fury, the Fitzgerald came upon Caribou Island. That's a small, uninhabited island located deep in Lake Superior on the lake's eastern side. North of the island is a reef known as 6 Fathom Shoal, making that area of the lake too shallow for a ship like the Fitzgerald to safely navigate. A fathom is a unit of depth equivalent to 6 feet. Cooper, knowing about that shoal, made a point of steering clear. McSorley's boat, the Edmund Fitzgerald, passed much closer to the island. During the Coast Guard hearings, Captain Cooper of the Arthur M. Anderson described his memories of seeing the Fitzgerald pass by that spot. In this testimony, he refers to Captain McSorley, and she means the Edmund Fitzgerald.
We were concerned that he was in too close, that he was going to hit that shoal off of Caribou. He was about 3 miles off the land beacon. That's a very fringe on that shoal area that extends out northeast from Caribou Island. And when he got in that close, he was over that 36-foot spot there. There's a 6-fathom spot, a pretty good-sized, extensive 6-fathom spot. And then out farther is a 25-fathom bank. I hauled out around both of those because when you get over those damn shallow waters, you can get a hell of a sea. You get a much bigger sea right in those particular areas than you do out in the deep water. Eyeballing her down there, all I can say is it's clear she was closer than I would want to be. Captain Bernie Cooper.
John Bacon points out that there are a range of possible reasons why the Fitzgerald took a different route past the island than did the Anderson.
They had not taken that route in at least a year, and maybe several years, from what the guys were telling me. I don't know. But he was not at all familiar with that route. You go 50 times the other way, and now you got to go 1 time this way, which of course gets you into the shoals, Caribou Island, areas of the lake he does not know very well. It's 1,300 feet deep in the deepest, but it's 11 feet by the shoals, and that's got to get your attention. And you're switching charts, as they say, maps to us. Are you reading the right chart? Are you reading the wrong chart? The chart he had turns out was very insufficient and off by a mile. I didn't know that when I started. I don't know if he knew that. He probably didn't. 2, he might have switched charts too soon, in which case Caribou Island does not appear. That, again, is a thing that you do if you don't know the route.
Did the Edmund Fitzgerald strike bottom at 6 Fathom Shoal? If so, what kind of damage did the impact do? While McSorley would later mention experiencing damage, he didn't mention any shoaling, presumably because if it occurred, he didn't know. This might seem confusing. Wouldn't you know if your ship struck a reef, even only briefly? On the Titanic, they certainly knew they hit an iceberg, even if they didn't initially realize how severe the damage was. The difference is that the Fitzgerald was pitching and rolling in violent water, and there was nothing above the surface to indicate a hazard. Under those conditions, it might not be at all obvious that a freighter had scraped the bottom. Here's Alandra Warner.
You're in the water that you're going up and down. You're in troughs and coming back up. So if you hit that shoal trough, you're having to come back up again. Your ship is just not steady. So it's wrenching.
Here's John Crowley, a retired U.S. Coast Guard Rear Admiral who was on the lake that night.
It's totally believable that if you got too close to that shoal spot, 6 fathom spot, that with the sea that's a-running, you're at the bottom. Now, the question is that people ask, would you know that you did or not? And Ordinarily, I mean, this is just Crowley talking based on years of sea service. Ordinarily, I think you would. But if you spent your last 12 hours banging and creaking and hearing all sorts of noises as the boat twists and plummets and goes up and down and crashes into the next wave and shudders, and I mean, I don't know what you would feel. I mean, I don't know what you would feel if you would know that happened.
Consider the experience of Dennis Hale, the sole survivor of the Daniel J. Morrell. The Morrell was a 603-foot freighter that sank during a Lake Huron storm in 1966. Hale told his story many times before he died in 2015 at age 75. Here's Dennis Hale in a 2013 lecture for the Grosse Pointe Historical Society describing what he experienced when the Morrell broke in two on the surface of Lake Huron.
Later that night, I was awakened by a loud bang. And in my slumber, I just assumed it was the anchor bouncing on the bow or something. So I rolled over to my right side, facing a bulkhead of all. And as soon as I did that, there was another loud bang. And this time, all the books came off my bookcase. Never happened before. So I figured, well, if it's going to get that rough, I better get up. I reached overhead to turn on my bunk light, and it wouldn't come on. Right then and there, I guess my heart quickened a little bit. I knew something had to be wrong. Well, I pulled the curtains away from my bunk, and as I did that, the general alarm sounded. Well, at first I tried to turn it. Well, yeah, I told you I tried to turn it on. But as I pulled that away, the general alarm sounded, and I could see small sparks from where the hammer was hitting the bell. Well, I jumped out of bed and I reached overhead and I found a life jacket put on. Only had undershorts and a life jacket on at this point. Opened the door to the companionway that led to the main deck. And as I did that, Al Wimmy came out of his room, the middle room, and he got to the opening that led to the main deck before I did. And he said, "Oh my God, oh my God." I says, "Al, what is it? What's going on, Al?" And he didn't respond to me, just headed back towards his room. I actually stepped out onto the main deck. And as I looked towards the stern, the ship was hogged. I couldn't see the stack or any lights. I could see lights coming up where the deck ended, but I couldn't actually see the rear of the ship.
Notice that Dennis Hale used the term hogged, meaning that the ship was bending upwards at the center, in this case as it split apart. That term will come up again in the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Anyway, if a couple loud bangs, something you initially think it's safe to ignore and go back to sleep, are all you get when a freighter is starting to split down the middle, you can imagine that the noise from a mere scrape along the bottom might be something you could miss during a violent storm. Rick Barthuli, who was on the Anderson that night, told author John Bacon that, quote, "it would have felt about the same as plowing through a wave." Whatever did or did not happen at 6 Fathom Shoal, by 3:30 p.m., McSorley radioed the Anderson with a list of concerns. He described damage to the Fitzgerald's topside fence and to some vents, and he said he had a list. At this point, the Edmund Fitzgerald slowed down so the Anderson could catch up. McSorley asked, quote, "Will you stay by me until I get to Whitefish?" To have a list means that your vessel is leaning to one side. Why? Because you're carrying an uneven load. For example, if you have water leaking into the ballast tanks on one side of your boat. Here's Kaylee Matuzak.
The vent, I believe what he would have been referring to would have been like the vents that allow airflow into the ballast tanks. So if you lose one of those, then you're going to have even more water coming into the ballast tank from an angle that you can't control.
So losing the vent covers was bad, but the official investigation would later determine that losing a couple vent covers could not have, by itself, accounted for the loss of the vessel. Still, water was certainly entering the Edmund Fitzgerald's ballast tanks through the lost vents and possibly through its hull if the hull had been damaged by shoaling or cracked due to stress. In testimony to the U.S. Coast Guard, Captain Cooper of the Arthur M. Anderson said he believed the Fitzgerald must have somehow sustained damage below the waterline. In this testimony, he refers to Captain McSorley of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
I firmly believed that he had a damaged ship and didn't know how damaged she was. I believe she was cracked somewhere. She was taking water fast enough because what he told me was that I have a list and I'm taking water. And I said, "Have you got your pumps on?" And he said both of them. So from my experience on a previous occasion, I think what he did, he took that list, which seemed to be real fast as far as I was concerned, and that water level would have reached a level of his draft and stay constant no matter whether he had the pumps on it or not, if there was water coming in from below an opening in the hull. No matter how much you pump, if water is coming in faster, you are not going to lower the water in the tank because that water will stay at a constant level with the same list. Because you can't bring it down. You have the lake right there. Captain Bernie Cooper.
Was water also coming through the Edmund Fitzgerald's hatches? The hatches were the large doors atop the cargo holds, and the holds were full of taconite. Although a taconite pellet looks and feels like a rock, it contains clay, and clay can absorb water. It's not exactly a sponge, but 26,000 tons of taconite could absorb a meaningful amount of water, plus whatever standing water might have entered the hold, which could be pumped out only through 2 sections in one of the cargo holds. There were only screens dividing the 3 cargo holds, so water could flow freely among them if it were to enter the holds. The question of the hatches would become the center of the later wrangling over who or what was to blame for the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Here's Beyond the Breakers co-host Tanner Johnson explaining why the topic is so loaded, because it was the crew's responsibility to secure the hatches.
We see it in other stories too, is, when there is any sort of element of mystery, that sort of fog of war opens itself up to a lot of, sometimes it's conspiratorial thinking, but I haven't necessarily seen that with the Fitzgerald. But there's always friction between these narratives. If the narrative is, unsecured hatch covers, led to this ultimately massive flooding of the hold, well, it's like that story that puts a lot on the crew and saying, is this Captain McSorley not ordering this to happen? Is this the crew members themselves not doing it properly? Is this, complacency is a word you hear a lot of, that possibility. If this is how the ship has operated for years, you never think today is going to be the day it becomes a problem. And so like that element of the story puts a lot on the crew. And, obviously, if you are, family and friends of the crew, that's not the explanation you want to hear.
The Fitzgerald was being tossed by the waves, and think how long and narrow it was, with the once innovative weld and rivet construction method making it more flexible than an older ship like the Anderson. Great Lakes freighters have been called moving skyscrapers, and like a skyscraper, a freighter is meant to bend to some extent rather than break. Mariners who served on the Fitzgerald said it bent more than most. Sometimes when you were using an access tunnel that ran the length of the ship, the freighter would bend so much that you couldn't see the other end of the tunnel. One former Fitzgerald crew member, Richard Orgel, described the Fitzgerald's flexibility, or, quote, action, to Coast Guard investigators. In this testimony, he refers to Captain McSorley and she to the Edmund Fitzgerald.
She bends and springs considerably. When you're standing forward and looking aft, it will remind you of a diving board just after somebody jumped off the board, the diving board of a swimming pool. She did this whippingly. He said that this sometimes scared him. The springing was quite noticeable at the time. It wasn't jest. Richard Orgel.
So in those terrible conditions on November 10th, the Fitzgerald would have been twisting and bending with water repeatedly rushing over the deck. Captain Cooper later speculated that the reason the Fitzgerald's topside fence was damaged was not due to the force of the waves on the fence. It was made of wire, so water would have washed right through it. Instead, Captain Cooper thought the damage could be due to hogging, or the 2 ends of the ship bending down and away from the middle so the fence wire would be pulled to such tension it could break a rail. At 4:10, McSorley advised Captain Cooper of the Anderson that both of his radars were out. Amid the worsening snowstorm that limited visual range, you can see why McSorley wanted to wait for the Anderson to come near. Among other things, the Fitzgerald was relying on the Anderson for navigation. With the Whitefish Point light out of commission after losing electricity in the storm, and both the Fitzgerald's radars inoperational, McSorley needed the Anderson to use its radar and tell him whether he was still on course. The decision to slow down and wait for the Anderson, though, might have sealed the Fitzgerald's fate. Here's John Bacon.
When he slows down and waits for the Anderson, it cost him at least an hour, and they missed by about an hour. So they're going about 16 miles an hour at their fastest. They're 70 miles from Whitefish Bay, and you wait an hour. That is almost exactly the time they needed. So, and again, you can't blame the guy. He's doing the responsible thing based on what he knew.
In a radio conversation with the Swedish vessel Avafors, a northbound ship near Whitefish Point, McSorley radioed that he was experiencing, quote, one of the worst seas I've ever been in. The ship's list, he said, was getting bad. As John Bacon notes, that's saying something given that Laker captains are prone to understatement, at least on a public frequency.
You don't say anything on those radios. That's, as Rick Bartoli said, it's a party line, man. No one admits anything because you are essentially competitors. Why would I tell you, if I'm playing hockey against you, that my right knee hurts? I'm not telling you that. So these guys have got a lot of that mentality. and they put very little on the radio. So therefore, we know on November 9th and 10th, when McSorley starts confessing more than he ever has his entire career on that radio, it's not going well. And even at that, the Arthur Anderson did not think they're in that bad a shape based on what he was saying. He was that stoic about it. That's another kind of a problem that, these guys don't admit their problems when they need help. And he did, I think, to a large degree, but maybe not enough.
Captain Cedric Woodard of the Avafors had known McSorley for a long time and was shocked at how beleaguered McSorley sounded. As stoic as McSorley was, it was evident that his vessel was in trouble. When he was telling the Avafors about his bad list, McSorley turned away from the microphone, which was still on, and said, "Don't allow nobody on deck." The Arthur M. Anderson's last radio contact with the Edmund Fitzgerald came at 7:10 p.m. The Anderson was about 10 miles behind the Fitzgerald, and the ship's mate asked McSorley how the Fitzgerald was doing. McSorley's reply has gone down in history as the last recorded words from the Edmund Fitzgerald. He said, "We are holding our own." The Anderson's crew started watching for the Fitzgerald coming up on the horizon as they gained on the ailing ship. They saw nothing, and then they were alarmed to see that the Fitzgerald had disappeared from their radar. By 7:39 p.m., Captain Cooper began attempting to reach the Coast Guard to notify them that the Edmund Fitzgerald was no longer to be seen above the surface of the water. What exactly happened to seal the fate of the Edmund Fitzgerald? We know the ship was taking on water to the extent that it was sitting at a list, but as late as 7:10 p.m., Captain McSorley believed, even if he was overstating his confidence, that we are holding our own. Something happened and happened quickly. What was it? The short answer, waves. Here's Kaylee Matuzak.
Nature being what it is, like bad enough wind, bad enough waves, could definitely hurt anybody. I think the Fitzgerald was especially vulnerable because likely they were sitting lower in the water. They did report that list. So at some point, like once your cargo starts to shift forward and everything like that, if you're down by the head enough, like a bad enough wave you're not going to be able to recover from that.
Here's Tanner Johnson.
When, Captain McSorley is reporting some of this weather, we kind of talked about how localized that seems in his reports. He's reporting things that other vessels on the lakes aren't necessarily seeing. Everyone has bad weather, but he is reporting stuff. He's saying these are the biggest waves I've ever seen. And he's a very experienced captain. So that's a pretty big deal. And one of the theories there is the reason that the seas seem so big to him the fact that they're already riding low because they've taken on water, which, it makes sense time-wise at least. I assume that would have an effect. And then also I think it's certainly like when I started doing, any sort of research for the show for Beyond the Breakers, I kind of had a skewed idea of what it meant for a ship to take on water. First of all, ships are always kind of taking on a little bit of water. And then secondly, with a vessel carrying something like iron ore, especially at this time, it's very hard to know that you're taking on water. There's not a sensor for that. They don't have, cameras and alerts like we would have today at this time. So it's like unless someone had explicitly taken a look and looked very carefully, it would have been almost impossible to know that, these cargo holds were filling with water. Also the fact with them not being watertight, but between each hold. So it's like it doesn't seem, strange that this would have taken on a massive amount of water before anyone knew that was the case. We sort of talk a lot about how like a shipwreck is so rarely one thing, and it's typically just, a worst possible combination of factors. It's, if the ship is taking water in one place, but, the hatches are all secured and she's not taking water there, maybe she's fine. But, if there's multiple things going on at once, of course, that could pretty easily doom a ship like this.
Shortly before the Edmund Fitzgerald disappeared, the Arthur M. Anderson experienced massive waves that were heading south. On Lake Superior, the phenomenon of 3 rogue waves, which has been blamed for other shipwrecks and almost taken on the aspect of legend, is known as the Three Sisters. Here's L. Andrew Warner.
Three Sisters are a series of waves, and they come suddenly, and they're huge waves. The Anderson hit 3 waves. The first wave, you had water that started from the stern, rolled right up to the pilot house. Then, bang, another one came right again. So your ship hasn't had time to really get rid of the first water. It pushed it down. It pushed the bow down because you've got all this water coming at you. And then they have to, it's actually underwater, the bow is, and then they have to push to come back up. So then what he felt was in 10 minutes, it was going to be where the Edmund Fitzgerald is. And they were doing radar plotting for them because they had lost the radar, Fitzgerald had. And so if you're already vulnerable in the water and you have these powerful waves coming at you, you've got bang one, and without being able to recover from that one, you've got the other one, and then the third one does you in. You are going to be under, but you got to come back up. And Fitzgerald didn't come back up.
Here's Frederick Stonehouse with more on the Three Sisters theory.
You've got three big waves coming down the spar deck of the ship. They go over the cargo hatches. They meet in the back of the pilot house. They pile behind the pilot house windows. So they go from being roughly, I think the dance chance was about 4 feet or 5 feet of water that they could carry on the hatches. But there was enough water out there with those waves to be able to carry triple that and then collapse. So you had triple the collapse weight of the hatch. That becomes a cataclysmic event, no pun intended. There's such a rush of water coming in that now she takes a down attitude. You've got the water in the cargo hold, screen bulkheads, not waterproof bulkheads. So you've got a rush of water coming forward. It's much like a pivot point on an amusement park ride. She pivots down into the water at that point. Now you've got even worse because you've got 26,000 tons of marbles, give or take, that are rolling down the ship, the taconite pellets, and she literally knifes her bow into the bottom.
Again, Kaylee Matuzak.
In my mind, I think they definitely clipped the shoal a little bit. I'm sure that it wasn't like a terrible gash, but like if you have enough, then you're going to start to have more water than there should be in the ballast tanks. I don't necessarily know if there would have been water in the cargo hold, at least to begin with, because I don't believe the Coast Guard in the hatch cover theory. I don't think that had anything to do with it. So you start getting enough water, you start taking on that list, and then you lose your radar and all that. The weather's bad enough that once you have enough water throwing you to one side, that cargo is going to start moving. If there is water getting in the cargo hold, then you're going to have those taconite pellets shifting around like even more. And then probably a very big wave would have been the death blow, just enough that they went into the trough and then couldn't come back up.
And again, Tanner Johnson.
The fact that she's an ore carrier, she has these divided cargo holds, but they're divided by essentially like a mesh almost, where, it'll divide the ore, but water can, travel freely through it. And it's supposed to be an advantage in that you can pump out the hold without, needing to pump out each hold individually. But, in a case like this, where if you're taking water in certainly faster than your pumps can deal with it, that's obviously going to be a problem, because now it can fill the whole ship. It can't be compartmentalized, like was so touted with the Titanic of, how she could have X amount of flooded compartments and she would still be fine. It's like so many of the ships we talk about, especially some of these older ones, is, once there's water coming in, a lot of these big ships are just kind of a big, like a warehouse, it's just gonna keep filling up.
At the Museum Ship Valley Camp, which now houses the Edmund Fitzgerald's recovered lifeboats, Paul Sabrin is constantly asked what caused the ship to sink.
I have 3 answers. I don't know, I don't know, and I don't know. There are theories. Naturally, everybody has theories. There are investigations. There are comments. It's a whole combination of the perfect storm. So if I then point out to one particular reason for it, then we don't know. One can assume that it would have been then because the hatch covers. One could assume that it would have been the 6 fathom shoal. One would assume that it would be the sisters that hit it. One would assume that it was then the structure of the Edmund Fitzgerald. So it's almost like take your guess, take a pick. But if you do know, then please let me know, and I'll be able to share that with the visitors that come here.
When the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald came, it came quickly. There was apparently no time to make a distress call and no time to launch the lifeboats, although in that weather, they might hardly have been any use. Visits to the wreck have given hints, but no definitive evidence regarding what the crew might have been doing or thinking at the very end. Here's Frederick Stonehouse.
They are where they are. Whatever they were doing at the point in time they were doing it, when that ship had its cataclysmic failure, they went with it, and they went right now. When Morrell went down in 66, Steve Dennis Hale got off the ship because he realized something was happening, grabbed his life jacket, grabbed his trousers, I think, or grabbed his top coat, his pea jacket, and headed for the raft. That's something that even that amount of time didn't exist for Fitzgerald. It was a right now event.
Given everything we don't know about the crew members' final moments, Stonehouse thinks it's best not to speculate.
We've got a bad situation. In some way or fashion, the family members have dealt with it, and I think we should just leave it alone.
In the next episode, we'll talk about the immediate aftermath of the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the search for survivors, the spreading news of the disaster, and ultimately the years of debate over what exactly caused the vessel to founder. One of the people we'll hear from is the Duluth anchor, who was the first person to break the news to the world.
We had relatives of the people who died call us. We had friends. We had just interested persons who were living in the Twin Ports, living in the Northland, who wanted more information. But we actually had some family members call us. We were the pipeline between the lost ship and these families.
Edmund Fitzgerald, 50 Years Below is a production of the Duluth News Tribune. This podcast is written and narrated by Jay Gabler, with audio engineering by Wyatt Buckner and Dan Williamson. The audio of this episode was edited by Wyatt Buckner. Our editors on this project are Katie Roman and Barrett Chase, and our executive editor is Rick Lovers. Original score composed by William Brueggemann. Movie dialogue and testimony transcripts were read by Wyatt Buckner, Barrett Chase, and Dan Williamson. Thanks to our guests on this episode: Dennis Anderson, L. Andrew Warner, John U. Bacon, John Crowley, Tanner Johnson, Kaylee Matuzak, Paul Sabrin, Frederick Stonehouse, and Sarah Summers-Liedke. Thanks also to the Grosse Pointe Historical Society for permission to share Dennis Hale's story. Read more stories about the Edmund Fitzgerald and learn more about this podcast at DuluthNewsTribune.com. On November 10, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald failed to reach Whitefish Bay. In the last episode, we imagined what might have happened to the Fitzgerald, but now imagine a different scenario. Imagine you were on a laker that did survive that storm and reached safe harbor after the most harrowing journey of your life. Then, you were asked to turn around and go right back out into the storm. That was what was asked of the Arthur M. Anderson that night.
They're definitely competitors, but that night they helped each other out more than they ever would otherwise. And then I think heroically, man, you know how nasty it is. You know you're lucky to get home. You got to go back out before you even lay anchor. Look, hats off to Captain Cooper. Do I do that? Why, I don't know. I'd like to think I would, but I can't guarantee it. Heat of the moment, a lot of captains did not go out that night, as you know. Some did.
That's John Bacon, author of The Gales of November. In this episode, we pick up the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald on the night of November 10th, as Great Lakes sailors, the Coast Guard, and eventually the world came to the horrified realization that the Fitzgerald was lost with all hands. I'm Jay Gabler of the Duluth News Tribune, and this is Edmund Fitzgerald, 50 Years Below.
Coast Guard that night, the Fitzgerald Sun was far from being ready to go out and perform a major rescue. I mean, this is November. This is the classic time of the year for shipwrecks on the Great Lakes, and the big wrecks tend to be in November. All shipwrecks tend to be in November, general statement. But what's the Coast Guard got ready to go out and maybe save a life? They've got the Mackinac. Where's she? She's downstate under repair, out of service. They've got Mesquite ready to go. She's down under repair, out of service. So there goes two of your big rescue assets, potentially. Took them over time to get the helicopters aloft from Traverse City Air Base, as well as the HU-16 Albatross seaplanes, World War II property, by the way. All devices for a very marginal capability. And even the small boats along the south shore of Lake Superior were not prepared to go out. They wouldn't have survived anyway. They were the ones that were ready to go and the ones that thought was being given to it, particularly the 36-foot motor-like boat out of Grand Marais, was immediately turned around once they realized what they were going into. That just was far beyond the situation. And nobody's ever asking a Coast Guardsman to commit suicide with poor equipment like that.
That's Frederick Stonehouse, author of one of the most read books about the Edmund Fitzgerald. As he points out, the Coast Guard asked the Anderson and other ships to go out and look for survivors because that night, the Coast Guard did not have many other options.
As I recall, the initial radio call went out to the Sioux Coast Guard station, and the Cooper reached the watchstander. And the watchstander is that Coast Guard individual that is on duty that night. And he answers the radio, he takes the messages, makes the coffee, does reports as necessary. It is an important job. It is a critical job. Who ends up with it that night? The lowest man on the duty totem pole. The man that knows the least is now in the position where he has the most capability of influencing an action. Now let's getting a rescue started. Didn't know what to do. Didn't know how to do it. Finally calls one of the chiefs in who does. They begin to get the process working, and that now will circle down to Coast Guard Coast Guard Rescue and Coordination Center in Cleveland, where they will now get things moving.
The Coast Guard did have a cutter in a port on Lake Superior that night. Unfortunately, that port was Duluth, way back at the point where the Edmund Fitzgerald began its journey over 24 hours before it went down. John Crowley was a crew member on that cutter, the Woodrush. He had just graduated from the Coast Guard Academy that year, 1975.
Fresh out of the academy, reported aboard. Well, graduation was on the 4th of June. Buddy of mine and myself took 2 weeks and flew over, space available, to Hawaii and just sat on the beach, and then came back for our classmate's wedding in San Antonio, and then we had to report in to our ship. So I picked up my car, my sea box, and came up here to Duluth, came up to Woodrush and saluted at the gangway and got assigned a rack, and then said, hey, you better find another place out in town. And so I went out of town to try to find a place, but all kind of happened, and then my little grandmother that next weekend comes up with my parents to see what I'm doing, what I'm going to be doing. And she goes, he went to college and he's on a ship like this with that little stinking cabin. What's all this about? She just couldn't understand it whatsoever, but it is what it is. And, life, you don't sign up for a life of princess cruises and that kind of song. You sign up for a different song when you enter in. So, it was a matter of immediately kind of getting thrown into the mail. They had the change of command, new captain, Captain Hobaugh, who had been the group commander here in Duluth, was cross-decking coming over and to take over command of the Woodrush. And so we were coming aboard at the same time. And I think one thing led to another, and I made a couple of scenes that he must have thought showed leadership, and we, hit it off pretty well from the very beginning. And therefore, I'm one of the watchstanders by the time November 10th comes along that fall.
On the night of November 10th, Crowley was off duty.
Much of the crew was down at I think it was the Sandbar, which was a bar on the sandbar off the beach here as extending out to Park Point right before you get to the lift bridge.
The Sandbar building would later become Grandma's Saloon and Grill.
We were watching Monday Night Football, a large number of the crew, and I remember it was Dallas and Kansas City. I don't remember who won. I probably wasn't there for the end of the game.
The football game, which Kansas City would ultimately win 34-31, was being broadcast on ABC. In Duluth, that meant WDIO, Channel 10. News anchor Dennis Anderson was at the studio.
I was at the television station, of course, preparing the 10 o'clock news, which was going to go on the air late that night because of Monday Night Football. Monday Night Football became a very popular program, so I knew we had a huge audience. I got a phone call from a woman in Superior who asked if I knew anything about a ship sinking in Lake Superior. I asked her when, and she said, I think it's tonight. No, but I'll check it out. I no sooner hung up the phone, I got another phone call from another lady, this one in West Duluth, basically asking the same thing. She had heard on shortwave radio that a ship had gone down in Lake Superior, didn't know what kind or the name of the ship. I put a call into the Coast Guard here in Duluth, and they confirmed a ship is indeed down. It's an ore carrier. I don't have any more information than that. Let me give you the phone number to Sault Ste. Marie, the Coast Guard there. So I called the Sioux, and they gave me all the information I needed. The name of the ship. They didn't know exactly how many people were on board, but they did tell me that the ore carrier Arthur M. Anderson had been following the Edmund Fitzgerald, and they could see the lights of it, and all of a sudden the Fitzgerald disappeared.
Dennis Anderson understood the magnitude of his responsibility.
That's a decision that weighs on a broadcast journalist. Do I dare go on the air with this? How much information that I know do I dare put out? Because I'm going to be informing. I knew I was going to be informing families and other loved ones of this tragedy. But the magnitude of the story, I think, forced me to be a part of that incident that night.
Dennis Anderson would become the first journalist to break the news of the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The news was so urgent, Anderson and his colleagues knew it could not wait.
We didn't have time to warm up the cameras, otherwise I'd have gone on a camera. But it takes minutes, 10, 15 minutes to warm up the camera, so I had to do it live on audio. So I went into the audio booth, they put a bulletin slide on the air, and I went on the air and said something like, we interrupt this program for a special news bulletin from the Channel 10 newsroom.
For people in Duluth, that Monday Night Football game would forever be associated with the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Dennis Anderson is now in his 80s and retired from WDIO. He still lives in Duluth.
I've had many, many people in the Northland tell me that they were watching the broadcast that night, and they remember me interrupting the football game for the broadcast, and then later for the 10 o'clock or later news that night. And they well remember that, and they said that we'll never forget how you told the story. And that just, again, proof to me that people all over this region still have the memories of that in their mind. Monday Night Football was fairly new, so I knew we would have a huge audience. I mean, the ratings on Monday Night Football were astonishing. So I knew we were going to have to get this right.
As news spread that the Fitzgerald was believed lost, families of the crew members were desperate for information. Here's John Bacon.
Their tools are limited. Their options are limited. We've got all the people in the Church household in Silver Bay. They're gathering around Mrs. Church's tiny AM radio transistor on the kitchen table. That's your news. Then you get Dennis Anderson, of course, on Channel 10 in Duluth. That cut through the noise, of course. But you have very little. And they don't have each other's phone numbers. There are no cell phones. They're not in each other's phones. You don't know any of this stuff. I'm struck how quickly these families connected to each other. They don't have a mimeograph list, even of the crew. They don't know what's going on. And they managed to find each other, and they became closest family themselves to this day. Columbia's not telling you anything. The whole thing is so slipshod. Bruce Hudson's mom, the legendary Aunt Ruth, she finds out on her way to work from the radio the next morning. This is, 15 hours later, and she had to pull off to the side of the road. You found out your only son is dead on the radio. That can't be right. So you take back to this era where Monday Night Football is one of the few things that connects you.
The crew of the Wood Rush returned to the cutter immediately. Here's John Crowley.
We got the call, and about 2.5 hours later, we were underway. And so it was all kind of a fever pitch at that point, understanding that Laker had been lost, unsighted, and on the other end of the lake, and we got gale storm winds and seas out there. So, as soon as you get back to the ship, it's about battening things down and making sure there's nothing loose and you're going to make it to the other side without losing stuff in the meantime. And so it's just a fever pitch, kind of get you ready. And then so that's when we first really learned about what had happened. And we knew, I think, that there were other resources responding, but, aviation, there wasn't, I don't think, anything to see for the most part. And the other surface vessels were smaller than us. And as the sea started to build and build, they got out underway, but really never were able to conduct a search because they had limitations or restrictions placed on them.
The Wood Rush would arrive on the scene the following evening.
We got underway, I think, just after midnight on the 11th, following that evening on the 10th's report. So a couple hours later, underway, about 20 hours, arriving about 8 o'clock in the evening on what we assumed was on scene, which was not too specified at that time. I mean, there were some indicators from the Anderson that had reported when they thought they had last seen things of that nature. But as soon as we got underway, I mean, this whole trip, you got a northeaster out there and a northeaster running down Lake Superior, particularly this last run down to the Duluth area. That's down the gut. And right at the end of the gut, where is it? It's at the lift bridge and where you sail out of. And so just going through under the bridge there, you had swell starting to build. And it's not been that hard, that long at that point that storm had built, but it had affected us.
As the Wood Rush sped eastward across Lake Superior, word of the Fitzgerald's loss spread. Here's Dennis Anderson.
That night, we informed one of our sister stations down in the Twin Cities what had happened. They were the only other media that we informed, and they weren't even aware of it around the region until the next day. And then we got bombarded with stations really all over the United States. And so we did a number of reports for them, both audio, and we did send some video to some stations. But it didn't take long before it got to a national story.
The Duluth Herald was the city's afternoon paper. On November 11th, the Herald's front page headline read, "Laker sinks, 29 lost."
The U.S. Coast Guard today reported the Edmund Fitzgerald, a Great Lakes bulk carrier, has sunk after disappearing from radar about 7:10 p.m. Monday with 29 persons aboard. Quote, "It has sunk. The ship disappeared off the radar scopes in the area, and we've searched 18 hours for the vessel. We classify it as sunk," said a spokesman at Coast Guard headquarters in Washington. The Coast Guard determined that the vessel sunk after making positive identification of a life raft from serial numbers found on it. No presumption of the crew's fate had been made as of noon Central Standard Time, said Chief Jer Bennett, officer of the day at U.S. Coast Guard Operations Center in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. Duluth Herald, November 11th, 1975.
Just about the time that newspaper was hitting Duluth doorsteps, the Wood Rush was arriving on the scene. Here's John Crowley.
Well, I think that you always want hope, whether that's a reasoned statement or not, I don't know, but you always want to feel that. And I think that what we knew and what the word that spread was that, about 10 years ago in a previous sinking, and one of the members of the crew did survive, and now different kind of circumstances, but so you think you might find, survivors, might find the lifeboats, might find, so that's what you're hoping to be able to find. And the fact that nobody has seen them yet, trying to see a lifeboat, even from in the middle of a storm, even when you have a low-flying Coast Guard HU-16, which was up that night, and I think the Canadians had some C-130s as well. But I've been up, as a cadet, I also got sent to the aviation side to spend a couple weeks figuring out what they do and what their world's like, and it's hard to see. So with that in mind, I say that because then I go, just because somebody doesn't see anything and there's no reports right now, doesn't mean there's nothing down there. And so you go look now, and I think my memory is I had the watch when we first got on scene. And within about a half hour, we found a life ring that added some degree of hope. But that was the last thing we found.
When the Fitzgerald's badly damaged lifeboats were located, hopes of finding survivors dimmed further. Those 2 lifeboats are now on display at the Museum Ship Valley Camp in Sault Ste. Marie. Here's curator Paul Sabrin.
Lifeboat number 2 was washed ashore at Mamaines Point, which is north of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. And lifeboat number 1 was spotted by the Arthur M. Anderson the next morning at 8 a.m. and was picked up by the Rice, which was one of the boat that was then surveying the area.
Responders' focus turned to finding the wreck itself. Here's Kaylee Matuzak of the Lake Superior Maritime Visitor Center.
Yeah, people, I think, because either if they've heard the song or they weren't there, when everything actually went down, they assume, maybe Titanic type, it's still missing. So a common question we do get is did they ever find it? It's pretty much the next day, actually, with the big magnet.
John Crowley on the Woodrush assisted with the search. The wreck's location would ultimately be determined on Friday, November 14th by a U.S. Navy plane with a magnetic anomaly detector. But the Woodrush had an early hint of where the wreck might be.
I think a lark, as much as anything, I turned on the fathometer just to see how deep we were and things like that. And we kept that running, and that has a trace capability. And when we went back and looked, we noticed as we kind of did our search pattern when we crossed this one area, we were getting a bit of a different blip. And I don't know that means anything particularly. Kind of filed it away. And as later flights by Navy capability that looked for magnetic anomalies, and that might be the vessel on the ground floor, and then the towed array that came in those first couple days in terms of the search, where it was the same spot where we marked from our own fathometer, which is a very crude instrument. This is now 50 years ago, almost today.
Once the wreck's general location was known, the Woodrush was enlisted to use side-scan sonar to learn more details. That involved lowering a transducer array into the water and towing it over the location where the wreck was believed to be.
Then we had the submersible arrive, and so we went into Sault Ste. Marie, collected that, probably a few of the technicians that go with that, set it up on board, put it out, did our, then set up a very precise pattern, just like we would on a search and rescue scale, but a precise pattern for the tow. And I remember looking at over the shoulder of the technicians, and they got a screen, and that looks like a black and white, TV that's not tuned in. It's a lot of dots and a lot of spikes on it. It's not telling me a damn thing. And also they say, okay, I think we got something that passed. We're a little bit to the side. We got to come back over, and so they're trying to tell me more about where we had to sail so that we would get a good picture of what they were seeing. And then they could tell more about it. And so we, that was a repetitive process, and not just once, but another time they tuned things up again, and eventually they'd go, okay, this is what we're seeing. Here's it looks like the part of the ship, and in either not knowing what the situation is yet, but either the foreship or the stern of the ship with the deck house. This is one of those deck houses, and so they knew that much, but didn't know which one. You don't see signs, you don't see the deck equipment to understand the orientation or any of that yet.
So at that point, just days after the Fitzgerald sank, the Woodrush knew there were 2 large pieces of wreckage on the lake bottom. They lay about 17 miles north-northwest of Whitefish Point in Canadian waters.
And almost immediately, there's a sense of there will be a more formal investigation, Marine Board investigation, and so that meant that They were looking at, I don't remember the exact timeline of preparing, but they started looking at using a submersible to go down and be able to take pictures, get more detailed information. How would we support that was the question. So we had to construct our own mini Loran system with repeaters so we could go out and pinpoint where we needed to be. And then the idea was we'd establish a 3-point more over that point, so that we could control our orientation as the submersible went down. So there were a lot of planning. What kind of buoy anchor would we use to moor to the bottom? You know, in that case, how deep of the line? What's the scope to put out? I mean, a lot of the work that a buoy tender really has a pretty good idea on. So I think we did a pretty good job from my lowly vantage point of preparing for the spring when the investigation was going to come back and we were going to be the platform, and it was going to be a pretty unique opportunity to see how the next phase, ran out.
The Wood Rush would return in spring 1976 to get a more detailed look at the wreck. It was clear, though, that the Edmund Fitzgerald had been lost. In the city where the Fitzgerald had been expected to unload its ore, the Detroit Free Press reported on community reactions.
In Washington, United States Representative Philip Ruppy, a Republican from Michigan, called for an inquiry into the loss of the ship, which at 13,600 tons is the second largest ship ever lost in Superior. 2 Coast Guard boats remained on Lake Superior Tuesday evening, and the air search was scheduled to continue Wednesday. While the fate of the crewmen remained in limbo, Tuesday, the bells of the Mariners Church, 170 East Jefferson, in Detroit, were rung 29 times by the church's pastor, the Reverend Richard W. Ingalls. At a noon ceremony, Ingalls also offered prayers for the lost men. The Fitzgerald had been scheduled to arrive in the Detroit River at 5 p.m. Tuesday. The Detroit mailboat, J.W. Westcott, had 5 bags of laundry, some freight, and a bag full of mail waiting here for the crew. Detroit Free Press, November 12, 1975.
The Coast Guard's inquiry into the wreck officially began on November 18th. From mid-November through mid-December, the appointed Marine Board took testimony from dozens of people, including Bernie Cooper of the Anderson, who repeated his insistence that the Fitzgerald had gone over 6 Fathom Shoal. Divers looked at the shoal and found no evidence of recent damage to the rock, although it's possible they could have missed something, or that the ship hit but failed to leave a mark. When it became possible to view the wreck, there also was no clear evidence to support the hypothesis of a hull fracture taking place before the ship sank. That said, viewing the wreckage left a lot of open questions. In May 1976, the Wood Rush returned to the wreck with a submersible that had a black and white television camera, allowing investigators to actually look at the wreckage identified the previous November. Here's John Crowley.
The fascinating part to me was sitting kind of in the wardroom with the TV screen after the submersible went down, and we're starting to see the damage. And the first thing you see is the name board. So, okay, this is the Fitzgerald. And then the next thing they would go around to focus on is the part of the vessel where they had separated and looked at basically torn metal. And so the naval engineers that were aboard, they looked like, I have this image of being kids in a candy shop, because they got, okay, what's the size and the kind of steel at that part of the ship? And they pulled out that information. They, were estimating the size at the rips and the jagged versus straight. And they're going, man, that thing must have hit the bottom at some tremendous speed. And so, it's just, then that kind of lit up the room. How did that happen?
That officially confirmed the wreck was the Edmund Fitzgerald, lying on the lake bed in 2 large pieces as well as countless smaller bits. The bow or front section sat right side up, while the stern or rear was upside down. The official investigation would ultimately conclude that the Fitzgerald split up when it dove to the bottom at high speed, its propeller still spinning. Here's author Frederick Stonehouse.
And that's the way transportation would set it up, with the torquing action of hitting the bottom, possibly breaking off the stern or separating the vessel into 3 pieces. all of them relatively close to one another. So did they crack on the surface, as Cousteau believed? Maybe. Did they crack on the bottom, structurally hitting, as as transportation safety believed? Maybe. I don't know it makes any real difference at this point in time.
Beyond the Breakers co-host Tanner Johnson, who has studied a lot of shipwrecks, also thinks it's most likely the Fitzgerald split upon impact with the bottom.
Did she break up on the surface? Did she break up after she had already started to go under? And I think also in terms of like the ship, the possibility of breaking in half on the surface, that is something that the more that we've covered stories like that is the idea that, rather than when that happens to a ship, rather than both sides going down really quickly, they stay afloat for a long time. And so, when that happens, you often do have a chance to send out an SOS. You do have a chance to communicate because, it's not just going to drop like a stone. And so I think that is, one of the things that sort of maybe took that somewhat off the table is you'd think that would have given an opportunity to just send out a call.
The official marine casualty report would not be released until 1977. Most of the report was simply a detailed accounting of what was known about the Edmund Fitzgerald, the storm, and the wreck. The report proved controversial, though, because of its conclusion.
The most probable cause of the sinking of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald was the loss of buoyancy and stability resulting from massive flooding of the cargo hold. The flooding of the cargo hold took place through ineffective hatch closures as boarding seas rolled along the spar deck. U.S. Coast Guard Marine Casualty Report, July 26, 1977.
Those 3 words: ineffective hatch closures. Here's Kaylee Matuzak.
I'm of the mind that the hatch cover theory was the Coast Guard's way of kind of putting the blame on people that are no longer alive to dispute it, as opposed to a company that might be able to do some stuff with some money. That's my mind.
Again, Tanner Johnson.
If the narrative is, unsecured hatch covers, led to this ultimately massive flooding of the hold, well, it's like that story, that puts a lot on the crew. And saying, is this Captain McSorley not ordering this to happen? Is this the crew members themselves not doing it properly? Is this complacency is a word you hear a lot of that possibility. If this is how the ship has operated for years, you never think today is going to be the day. It becomes a problem. And so like that element of the story puts a lot on the crew. And, obviously, if you are, family and friends of the crew, that's not the explanation you want to hear.
John Crowley said debates over the cause of the Edmund Fitzgerald's loss started during the search itself, and that the 2 basic narratives, it was shoaling versus hatch covers, had emerged early on. Each of the Edmund Fitzgerald's 21 cargo hatch covers had 68 manually positioned clamps. That makes a total of 1,428 clamps.
That's a lot of clamps to go make sure are tied down, are cinched down, as you come through underneath the lift bridge, and you're going around, make sure that's done, and you're already starting to feel the seas. So, that skepticism as to whether the hatches are going to be tied down tight, and then there's a report on the vents haven't been torn away, and I don't know that lets in one hell of a lot of water, but it's something. So you get 2 camps and 2 feelings out there. And as I kind of understood it, it was other captains that were reporting hated to report sounding like McSorley didn't do his job because he was admired. Now, whether they were really being honest with what they reported or whether they were soft selling what they felt, nobody knows except them. And I'm not going to enter into that debate.
Frederick Stonehouse is inclined to listen carefully to Captain Cooper's views on shoaling, but he points out that there is simply no definitive evidence. Stonehouse references the Michipicoten, a Canadian freighter built in 1952 that, in 2024, suddenly developed a 13-foot crack in its hull, likely due to structural fatigue. Stonehouse also mentions the Arthur B. Homer, built in 1960 and considered a sister ship to the Edmund Fitzgerald. The Homer was lengthened in fall 1975, the very season the Edmund Fitzgerald was lost, but quietly laid up just 5 years later. When the Arthur B. Homer was scrapped in 1987, it was interpreted as a casualty of that decade's collapse in world steel production. But speculation has long swirled that the ship's operators feared that if structural failures contributed to the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the very similar Arthur B. Homer could also be vulnerable. Here's Frederick Stonehouse.
Cooper was the only witness to the problem. He's the nearest single witness, the fellow that was on site and on scene. If he believes it was shoaling, you've got to put a lot of credit within that. But you also had Dick Race and Neptune Marine go out there immediately after the wreck to survey the shoal and found no evidence of being structurally hit by any vessel. I think you've got to put that in the mix of what you're doing. You've got the idea that she cracked in two, brittle steel fracture. Was it a fracture of the hull getting back to Mishpacotton? Why did the sister ship Arthur B. Homer be taken out of service very rapidly after the Fitzgerald sank? Is there a connection between the two? The sister ship, does she have the same design problem Fitzgerald had? If that indeed is true, if there's any evidence supporting it, because again, when you roll back and you say, where's the data? There is lots of thought and lots of people hold their hand up, but nobody's sitting there with the gold key that explains what happened.
The Lake Carriers Association, which represented Great Lakes shipping companies, responded to the Coast Guard report with a strongly worded letter in September 1977. Here are excerpts from that letter.
The lake shipping industry, proud of its safety record through the years, completely rejects the Coast Guard theoretical cause of the Fitzgerald sinking. We call attention to almost 40 years' experience with the current type of hatch covers and closure clamps that have been improved during the period. If ineffective closings exist, as alleged by the Coast Guard, surely, during the 40 years operating experience, there would have been watery cargo to unload, be it ore, grain, or stone. This not only would have been readily apparent, but also a costly problem that vessel and cargo owners would not tolerate. Regarding the Fitzgerald, it is also questionable whether water in the cargo hold would have resulted in a list, since it would not have been restricted to one side of the vessel. Letter from Lake Carriers Association to the National Transportation Safety Board, September 16, 1977.
The Lake Carriers Association argued that the water being pumped, McSorley said his pumps were working, was coming from the ballast tanks, not the cargo hold. How did the water get into the ballast tanks? Most likely from shoaling, the Lake Carriers Association argued, but definitely not through the hatches. There were several later dives on the wreck, and yet even being able to survey the wreck in detail didn't answer many questions about exactly what happened on the night of November 10, 1975. Frederick Stonehouse wrote one of the first books on the disaster, and he's been closely following everything that has happened since. The most recent edition of his book, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, has just been published. Even after all these years, though, even after all the scholarship and science and speculation that's gone on, he says we haven't really learned all that much.
We don't know anything more about what the Fitzgerald sunk today than we do when it sunk. A little bit more. We know who was on it. We have better crew roles. We certainly have an opportunity to determine the depth and the physical structure of the wreck with limited one dive, essentially for survey purposes officially, and then a couple of dives that were more showman dives than they were anything else. Done for the best of reasons, but they weren't dives that determine the engineering structure of the vessel or the cause of loss, particularly. So 50 years later, we don't know anything more. At the point that the last dive went down in August, I think it was, of 1989, which was the last survey dive done on the wreck. I was there for that too, very interesting, but that was the last hard information that came off that wreck. And everything else was pick them up along the way. In other words, we managed to sneak a publicity dive in for Joe McGinnis, for example, doing his survey. He recovered the bell. It was certainly a very goodwill gesture, but didn't add anything to the knowledge of the wreck. So in my view, there's nothing that we have any different now than we had when she went down.
Today, diving to the wreck site is forbidden by the Canadian government. In the final episode of this podcast, we'll hear from a man who dove to the wreck before the prohibition took effect, becoming one of the very few people to ever see and touch the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
we were looking at our gas. It took us a bit longer than we thought to descend. I bet it took us close to almost 10 minutes to descend the full length. But I remember I said, all right, well, let's turn around and let's go up to the main deck level and then the wheelhouse, which was right there. And, just to see the name on it. And I tend to be a very kinesthetic person. And so one of the things that it was kind of a relief. It's like, okay, a lot has gone into this. We're here.
Edmund Fitzgerald, 50 Years Below, is a production of the Duluth News Tribune. This podcast is written and narrated by Jay Gabler, with audio engineering by Wyatt Buckner and Dan Williamson. The audio of this episode was edited by Wyatt Buckner. Our editors on this project are Katie Roman and Barrett Chase, and our executive editor is Rick Lubbers. Original score composed by William Brueggemann. Newspaper archive excerpts and other historical documents were read by Terry Caddo, Barrett Chase, and Dan Williamson. Thanks to our guests on this episode: Dennis Anderson, John U. Bacon, John Crowley, Tanner Johnson, Kaylee Matuzak, Paul Sabrin, Frederick Stonehouse, and Terrence Teisall. Thanks also to Maria Lockwood of the Superior Telegram for participating in our interview of Dennis Anderson. Read more stories about the Edmund Fitzgerald and learn more about this podcast at DuluthNewsTribune.com.
Through control, the captain of the port speaking. We have no other vessels in that vicinity right now. Or I guess I should say there are several other saltwater vessels there that we're also trying to have assist in the search. But it looks from the information that we have that it's fairly certain that the Fitzgerald went down. And we're talking now about a matter of life and death and looking for survivors that might be in life rafts or in the water. And we can only ask the masters to do the best without hazarding their vessel. If you think it would be unsafe and would hazard your vessel, then you have to do whatever best you can. But if you could come about and head into the sea and try to stay in that area, and maybe we could pick up some survivors, if not at night, then maybe at first light.
The wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald resulted in a tragic loss of life. 29 men who are still deeply mourned by those who knew them. And yet, over the years, there have been many other shipwrecks, not to mention many more calamitous accidents on water, air, and land. As the years have passed, this wreck, this calamity, has remained the subject of widespread fascination and deep emotion, even among millions of people who had no direct connection to the Edmund Fitzgerald or even to the Great Lakes at all. Why is that? The people we talked to had an idea.
And I think there's a lot of reasons why this story holds such fascination. But I will say this too, I don't know that I always understand it too. When I say that, I mean the emotions that people bring to this interest in this story. And I will say this too, I've spoken with some of the family members and they're kind of the same way. They don't always understand it with how emotionally connected so many people that don't really have a connection to the story. Again, they didn't lose their dad, they didn't lose their brother, but yet they're tearing up. There's that emotional connection, which whether we understand it or not is not really relevant. It's there. So people have that connection. So why do they have it? Well, they're aware of it mostly probably because of Gordon Lightfoot.
To younger folks that might not remember and or have a reason to know about the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, they just might know the Gordon Lightfoot song.
The ballad is so haunting, and that's what really got people, what kept the interest in that shipwreck.
The power of a song. Who would know that there's a Folsom Prison? Folsom Prison? San Quentin, because Johnny Cash did his second song there, and with a boy named Sue, and he did the song San Quentin. My point, though, is those prisons, those names would not be remembered to this day. Back to the Lightfoot song. Why is there Fitzgerald remembered? I say because of the song. He brought light to it. He brought information and put everybody's eyes on the subject, eyes and brain and heart on the subject. And because of that, that's why this book was written. That's why these articles were done. That's why I believe we still remember it today.
In this final episode, we'll look at the legacy of the Edmund Fitzgerald, at how the ship is remembered and why. We'll also look at what we still have to learn from this haunting story half a century later. I'm Jay Gabler of the Duluth News Tribune, and this is Edmund Fitzgerald, 50 Years Below. David James Carlson kind of looks like Gordon Lightfoot. In fact, when the two hung out together back in the 1970s, people thought they were related.
People would always say, "Are you Gordon's brother?" And I would say, "Nah," before I got the N, before I got the O out of no. "No." He would come over, put his arm around my shoulder, shaking me, kind of laughing. He said, "Yeah, he's my little brother, can't you tell?"
Carlson is well suited for his job today as frontman of the Gordon Lightfoot Tribute Band. They play all sorts of songs by the late Canadian musician, but there's one that always gets a particularly strong response.
Any club we play in, there's always going to be like people who are like farther away, like in a bar or some booths. From the tables and the booths and the chairs that are all closer than the 100 people that are in the show. They're the ones who are really into the show, and all of us, and the other people are listening too, kind of. But when we do the Fitz, people come in from the other rooms. People are all coming in. They would say, "We had to come out to hear that song." People would come from just gather.
Gordon Lightfoot once told Carlson about the inspiration for The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
And there was an article, I don't know where the article was printed, but he read it. It was like about a 3 or 4 paragraph little article, just telling the details. Went down, oh, wow, so sad. And Lightfoot went, "I can't believe it. That's all? This happened and that's all?" He was upset. He told me he used a little bit more language. Zaya. So he went into his parlor and for 3 days, pen to paper, a guitar chord in his hand, and he was working on it. And he had been working on like a melody with using those chords and kind of, hey, I'm kind of coming up with something. And now I got something to put it to, and he improved the melody, but now he had words, and he wrote the thing, and it became such a hit.
Lightfoot drew on multiple news reports when writing his song, but one important story was a brief article in Newsweek. Journalists James R. Gaines and John Lowell brought together many of the facts that Lightfoot would use in his song, and they situated the story in historical context. Here's the opening of the Newsweek article.
According to a legend of the Chippewa tribe, the lake they once called Gitchigumi never gives up her dead. Modern-day mariners of Lake Superior know the legend has some basis in fact.
The article goes on to describe the lake's treacherous history and the circumstances surrounding the loss of the Fitzgerald. It concludes,
in the stone 126-year-old Mariners Church in downtown Detroit, a minister offered prayers for the lost seamen and tolled the church bell 29 times in grim tribute to the unslaked furies of Lake Superior. Newsweek, November 24th, 1975.
Lightfoot recorded the new song with his band, and remarkably, they used the very first take for inclusion on the album Summertime Dream, released in June 1976. The album's peppy title track was released as a first single because no one would ever have guessed that a 6.5-minute ballad about a shipwreck could become a hit. In 1976, radio host Dave Strandberg was doing overnights on Duluth station WAKX.
Listener called me. Actually, the Summertime Dream album had just come out, I don't know, a couple days earlier. And somebody called when I was doing the midnight shift and said, "Hey, did you realize that Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald is a cut on that album?" No, I didn't. I hadn't played the whole album, so I put it on and previewed it. Oh, this is great. Put it on the air, and people started calling. What was that? Oh, that was the new album from Gordon Lightfoot. It had this cut on it. Can we hear it again? Sure. So I ended up playing it several times that night. And by morning, the phones were lit up, and the program director at the time decided, hey, we're going to put this in
heavy rotation and start playing it. So he did, and the rest is basically history. The company, Warner Brothers, eventually decided to release it as a single because it got so much airplay around the Great Lakes particularly. And even though the thing ran 6 minutes, they put it out as a single, and it did quite well for Gordon. So kind of surprising that they released it as a single and it did so well nationwide.
The wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald would go on to hit number 2 on Billboard's Hot 100, the most popular song in the country, except for Tonight's the Night by Rod Stewart. For Dave Strandberg's role in making the song a hit, WAKX received a gold record plaque from Lightfoot's label. Years later, when the artist came to the Twin Ports on tour, he signed Strandberg's plaque. People living on Lake Superior were excited to have such a popular song about their own region, but the families of the lost men had mixed feelings. Bruce Lynn, director of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, has come to know many of those families well.
So many of them that we know absolutely adore Gordon Lightfoot. And I think maybe when they first heard the song, things were very raw, so to speak. It was a recent loss. Maybe some of them looked at it a little bit differently. But certainly Gordon Lightfoot and the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the song, contributed to that public awareness of this story and of this shipwreck.
While Lightfoot would go on to recognize the song as, quote, my greatest achievement, he took a risk in writing a detailed narrative about a real, recent event about which so much was and remains a mystery. The song contains one glaring error. The Edmund Fitzgerald was fully loaded for Detroit, not Cleveland. Then there was Lightfoot's characterization of the Mariners Church. Here's Bruce Lynn again.
Reverend Richard Ingalls from the Mariners Church in Detroit. You know, there's the lyrics that reference the musty old hall in Detroit. And this is actually, it is a funny story because Richard Ingalls, I don't know if it was a concert, I forget the context, but actually had the opportunity to talk to Gordon Lightfoot and told him who he was. And I think probably laughingly said, you know, you should really come and visit the Mariners Church. It's not a musty old hall. And I think they probably had a good laugh after that. But in the end, Gordon Lightfoot actually did subtly change that lyric too.
Lightfoot's most controversial lyric, though, concerned a very sensitive subject for the sailors' families. Here's David James Carlson quoting the offending lyric and explaining.
Later that night, a main hatchway caved in. He said, fellas, it's been good to know you. So that line there was a speculation. And later, after they did all the research with the underwater submersibles and so on, they said they determined the hatches were good. And Lightfoot felt ashamed. He apologized to the family members who were the exact, not just of the 29, but the 4 or 5 who were the ones who locked down the hatches. And he said, I am so sorry that I wrote that line in the song. I was speculating because the experts said it happened this way.
In the end, many of the families came to appreciate Lightfoot's sincerity and his role in elevating a story that would certainly, if not for him, be far less well known than it is today. Here's Bruce Lynn.
He would come to the Shipwreck Museum, and we would spend a little time with him. He wouldn't want to come on November the 10th, at least in recent years, since I'd been here. That wasn't a goal of his. He wanted to come here before that, even if it was a day before. But he didn't want to be the center of attention on November the 10th. He needed it and wanted it to be about the family members.
Here's David James Carlson.
Here and there, I've had a person give me a comment. Yeah, that song, that life, he's taking advantage and making his millions off of people who died. And boy, oh boy, do I ever give them a lecture. Not in an angry way, but I'll say, here's some things you do not understand. Every year, Gordon Lightfoot goes to the ceremony to honor the families. And guess who wants him there? The families. They have never said, this guy did us wrong. This guy did us right. Sorry, I get emotional. On this. He, in some way, has kept them alive. In many ways, he's shown the importance that they had.
The Lake Superior Maritime Visitor Center, at the foot of the aerial lift bridge in Duluth, tracks comings and goings in the port and duly recorded the departure of the Edmund Fitzgerald on November 9, 1975. Today, it's one of the places the ship is remembered. The museum has a display with artifacts including a life ring from the Edmund Fitzgerald, donated to the museum by the shipping line after the museum's curator noted the importance of the Twin Ports in the Fitzgerald story. Here's Kaylee Matuzak, who works at the museum.
It's pretty much the number one thing that we hear asked about besides like what ship is coming in and where's the bathroom. People are so curious about the Edmund Fitzgerald even 50 years on. This exhibit behind me here is the one that people really come to see. Some people don't even realize that they found the Edmund Fitzgerald, so people wonder about that. But yeah, people are very interested in it. We hear people back here playing the song like almost daily in the summer, honestly.
Until as recently as 2024, the Arthur M. Anderson was still working the Great Lakes and came to Duluth often.
We do say it like in the part of our script that we read for all the boats coming in. When the one for the Anderson does say that it's the last vessel that had visual, radio, and radar contact with the Edmund Fitzgerald. Sometimes people don't realize that like they'll hear the name and go, oh, it's got to be a different one. Surely nothing's been sailing that long, because they don't realize how long freshwater ships can stick around, you know? But yeah, people do come down here like specifically for the Anderson, specifically because of that.
The museum ship Valley Camp in Sault Ste. Marie is itself a retired Laker, built in 1917 and retired in 1966. The ship's holds now contain exhibits on maritime history. Curator Paul Sabrin speaks with many visitors who come to see artifacts including the Edmund Fitzgerald's lifeboats, the boats that could not be used, on November 10, 1975. We asked what it's like when family members of the Edmund Fitzgerald's crew visit the exhibit.
Very, very emotional. It's very, very emotional. I can only repeat it one more time. It's very emotional because they introduce themselves. Then I get the opportunity to be able to spend as much time as I can.
Sabrin has participated in the annual memorial ceremony at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum.
It was very emotional because I know that the executive director, Bruce Lynn, of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, inquired with me and said, Paul, are you interested in ringing the bell? I would say, definitely. And it was an honor on my behalf to be able to ring it for Captain McSorley. My wife was there and she was saying, Paul, are you okay? I think I was shaking. I think I was wondering, what is it? And I went there and I pretty much set the tone, if I would say, because I pulled as hard as I could so that it could be heard.
The ship's bell was removed from the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald on July 4, 1995, in an expedition conducted by the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, the National Geographic Society, the Canadian Navy, the Sony Corporation, and the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. The bell is now on display at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum. In 2006, Canada passed a law declaring 3 Great Lakes shipwrecks, including the Edmund Fitzgerald, to be marine heritage sites, forbidden to visit by diving or submersible without explicit permission from the government. Prior to that, there were a number of expeditions to the wreck by submersible, but in only one case are people known to have scuba dived to the site. In 1995, Terrence Tysall and Mike Z dove to the wreck together in what remains the deepest shipwreck scuba dive in Great Lakes history. Here's Terrence Tysall speaking about how the diver's support vessel remained in place over the shipwreck.
Since it is such a sensitive site, we were very careful not to hook into the wreck or use any of those traditional techniques like you throw gravel down to hook it or go down and chain into it or anchor the boat to it or anything like that, because we were trying to be extremely sensitive to everybody's sensitivities about the wreck. And so we literally utilized a drop camera that enabled him to keep the vessel on station effectively over the wreck.
The divers knew they would not have much time.
We planned on a short bottom time, approximately 15 minutes or so, to go down there. Yes, this is the Fitzgerald, and we wanted to go on the upright portion of it, which is, of course, the bow third, roughly. The midships is pretty much disintegrated. And we got good position over it. Our support team helped us get ready. We were diving big steel tanks with another tank of what we call travel gas mounted between those. The camera had gone a little deep, and we were just to the port side of the wreck. I mean, literally, it was an arm's length away. And, having seen the stuff from the old Navy footage, the curb that I think went down originally, and then some other ghostly photographs, I mean, it was quite obvious that you could see was the Fitzgerald. And we went all the way down to the bottom because we were following the camera, and that's where I have carried one of my first impressions of it, because it's mud clay bottom, and to this day I don't know if I've seen blocks of clay of this size. I mean, so it looks as if the ship is just steaming, almost like an icebreaker, through blocks of clay. I mean, meters, like maybe meters thick, that are just coming away, and they have that distinct panding on them, and then the silt layer on the top. And then to be there, and then we were looking at our gas. It took us a bit longer than we thought to descend. I bet it took us close to almost 10 minutes to descend the full length. But I remember I said, all right, well, let's turn around and let's go up to the main deck level, and then the wheelhouse, which is right there. And, just to see the name on it. And I tend to be a very kinesthetic person. And so one of the things that it was kind of a relief, it's like, okay, a lot has gone into this. We're here. And so to me, it was just the most natural thing in the world to just, there's the rail, right, sitting outside of the wheelhouse, and just watch my hands wrap around that rail. I mean, that was a really important moment to me. It's the first time that a living hand had touched that thing in decades.
Tysol and Z planned to make more dives, but the weather kicked up and that proved impossible. The divers emphasized that their intentions were respectful, and at the request of crew members' families, they did not release any images they captured during their dive. Still, the fact that they had successfully dived to the Edmund Fitzgerald demonstrated that it could be done, and might be done again, perhaps by divers with fewer scruples about leaving the wreck undisturbed. Still, Tysol points out that the strong prohibition on visiting the Fitzgerald is highly unusual when compared to other shipwrecks.
And I've been on countless wrecks, including some with human remains in the Great Lakes, where you can see the skeletal remains of people there. And I've been in U-boats and, wrecks all over the world, warships and other ships that many people have died on. And I've never seen a diver that I've been involved with ever act with anything of the utmost reverence. I mean, we put plaques down on the Atlanta and Guadalcanal, and a wreck that we did called the Athabascan, which was Canada's largest warship sunk in World War II. We had survivors on the surface that took us aside. They watched us dive them. They looked at our footage with us each day. We visited the graves of their comrades with them, the ones that were buried. But one of the most poignant moments on that is one of the survivors took us aside and pressed in my hand his German POW tags that he had to wear once they were captured. And he asked if I would personally take that down to the wreck so that could be with his shipmates. I mean, this is the spirit of which we visit these wrecks.
The extraordinary protection given to the Edmund Fitzgerald reflects the extraordinary amount of attention paid to that particular shipwreck. The annual memorial ceremony at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, when the ship's actual bell is rung in the presence of family members, is streamed online but no longer open for the public to attend in person. Bruce Lynn explains why.
And every November the 10th, when we host our memorial ceremony, leading up until the pandemic, we had it open to the public. We were honored. We loved it. The people really wanted to be a part of this. But it really got to the point where we couldn't stay ahead of it. That museum gallery is relatively small. A fire marshal would have shut us down on any of those November the 10th because we had so many people coming through, people wanting to be a part of it, to the point where standing room only in the entire gallery, people standing in the exhibits, which I thought somehow I can't stop what I'm doing in the middle of this ceremony, but I really need that guy to get out of that exhibit is running through my mind as we're doing this. So we had so many people, and then even when we had, let's say as an example, the 40th anniversary, we opened up multiple other buildings and then were able to live stream it inside those buildings. We just couldn't stay ahead of it. We even had people standing in line, going from the opening doors of the open doors of the museum all the way out to the lighthouse itself. It's I don't know how many, what are we talking, 30, 40, 50 yards or more, actually more. And we just couldn't handle those numbers. That was one thing, but something else happened that made me decide that we really needed to close this down to the public and then do a live stream in general, where anybody, anywhere in the world, if they have Wi-Fi, could see this this memorial ceremony that we would do. But what actually happened was there were a few people that, in a low-level way, but it was happening all the same, were kind of harassing some of the Fitzgerald family members a little bit. We had one gentleman who, he was an author and he wanted interviews with them. We had another individual who had some interesting, what I might call or describe as conspiracy theories about why the Fitzgerald sank, and he wouldn't let it rest with some of the family members. And so when we finish up that ceremony, there's a big crowd obviously inside the gallery, everybody's talking, people are filtering out. But if you can see someone will not let it rest with a family member or two or more, then we start thinking a little differently about how we do this. And that's ultimately how we ended up shifting gears and making it a private ceremony for the Fitzgerald family members. That's really all it was ever meant to be in the first place.
You may have noticed that we did not speak with any of those family members for this podcast. Bruce Lynn said he would mention to family representatives that this project was happening, but we didn't push any interview requests. Over the years, these family members have told their stories at times and places of their choosing. A number of family members talked with author John Bacon for his new book, The Gales of November. Bacon told us some of the things he learned about what it was like to work on a Laker like the Edmund Fitzgerald.
The incredible sacrifices of these families. You don't have a dad for 9 months out of the year. How is that not going to hurt? It hurts everybody. And my dad is around. I can't imagine what that was like, truly. So the sacrifices made before you get to the shipwreck were also, I think, a big part of the story. Just this hard lifestyle that it's the daughters, the wives, the sons, and the daughters, as life says, who paid the price, as well as the husbands. And John Hayes gave me a great line about this from his 35 years in the sea on the Great Lakes, that you take your family photos and you put them down on the table when you start the season, and you don't turn them over till only a week is left. Why? Because it's too hard. And you can't see your kids and your wife every day and not get incredibly homesick. And John Tanner, as tough as they come, he said the songs we played in the jukeboxes in Duluth and Two Harbors and Silver Bay, most of them are about homesickness. And I thought, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Brandy, You're a Fine Girl, of course, Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, all these songs, they played them a lot.
In addition to the ceremony at Whitefish Point, there's also an annual memorial ceremony at Split Rock Lighthouse on the north shore of Lake Superior near Two Harbors. Hayes Scriven, the lighthouse's site director, told us why they hold this ceremony.
A lot of people do wonder, well, why are you doing this? And my response is, well, I know a couple of the crew members were from, the North Shore area and the South Shore area. So there's some local connections there. There's still a lot of family that live in the area. But also, you notice that, and I've seen this too, that there's a lot of people, anybody that lives around Lake Superior, it feels like one big community to me. And you can just see that in events like this and in Lake Superior Day and other events that happen around the lake. Anything that happens, you feel connected to those people. And I think this event is a really good epitome of that or culmination of that, where it is just all these people coming together for one thing that affected them back, almost 50 years ago. And I think that's why it has the draw that it does, and that it has the connection and the emotional response that a lot of people still have to it.
Split Rock Lighthouse was retired in 1969, and now its beacon is rarely lit. It is, however, lit every year on November 10th in memory of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The beacon was also lit in May 2023 to mark the passing of Gordon Lightfoot.
The event started because Lee Radzak heard Gordon Lightfoot's song on November 10th of 1985, was inspired to go out and light the beacon. Some neighbors saw it, they started showing up. Since then, we've had more and more people come and want to be a part of it. For us, because of the nature of the event and how solemn it is and why we're doing this to honor the crew of the Fitz and everybody else that lost their life.
Each November in Duluth, a conference called Gales of November brings people together from across the country to talk about not just the Edmund Fitzgerald, but the entire past and present of maritime activity on the Great Lakes. Here's Rob Hoffman of the Lake Superior Marine Museum Association, which organizes the conference.
What we try to do is to commemorate the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald through storytelling but also in a way celebrating the vitality of Lake Superior when we retell the story and the bell is tolled and on their anniversary and things of that, and we're reminded of those things. Just I think our attention goes to Lake Superior, the awesomeness of Lake Superior, the immensity of what it means.
In the 50 years since the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the Great Lakes have not experienced another wreck of that scale. Why? What's changed? The most obvious answer is that weather forecasting has improved tremendously. Sarah Summers-Liedtke, director of the Lake Superior Maritime Visitor Center, said there have been additional safety improvements implemented since 1975.
One thing that the Fitzgerald didn't have was a sonar that was able to see underneath them or below them. So one of the theories was that they ran aground or ran into a shoal or something. And if they would have had that equipment, that technology, they might have avoided that if that's what happened. And there have been improvements to Coast Guard safety drills and training exercises. So, sometimes we get complacent about safety if we do the same things in and out every day, but it's important to keep those safety tips in mind because when you're out there in an environment that's like Lake Superior, anything can happen, and it's important to be prepared for those. So, and we do see a lot of vessels not traveling during really bad storms like during the Fitzgerald, and even weather predictions and getting that information from the shore to the ships, it has made significant improvements. So mariners get real-time almost readings from the buoys, the weather buoys that are out on the Great Lakes now. So all those changes are really impacting the safety in a positive manner for today's mariners.
Still, Frederick Stonehouse, who has been studying the wreck for decades, said he's disappointed that more has not been done. In addition, Stonehouse points out that Great Lakes freighter captains are more conservative today as well, in part because they need to be.
We're driving a lot of old iron on the Great Lakes. I mean, we have got old ships. And as a result, the captains are driving them like they're old ships. In other words, they're taking great care with them when we've got foul weather coming in. They're not afraid to go to port. They're not afraid not to leave port. If you pop open your AIS and watch it during a storm, you'll see the ships all huddled up in Whitefish Bay and huddled up at the point, under the Keweenaw Point and then down by Bay de Gris. You'll see them all over the Great Lakes, tucked down and away from the weather. The only ones you see out in the open would be the salties that don't know any better. So I think the human reaction has certainly taken place to mitigate the scale of the disaster that could occur anyway.
For Stonehouse, it's worth telling and retelling the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
What I've watched is the family members go from the upsetness of it all, of their family members being in the public eye because of the wreck, et cetera, and a value being placed on that's negative. In other words, my family members were impacted and died on this wreck, and we don't think you should be doing this in terms of selling books or doing movies or TV shows or sweatshirts or t-shirts, etc. Versus the argument that says the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald is a wreck that is important to all of us because it tells us a story of shipwreck, of survival, the big lake. It tells us a story of how people action, tells us a story of our own history of lake shipping today, tomorrow, and where it's going to be in 5 or 6 years. It also keeps that story alive in front of us. It keeps it that everlasting tale of shipwreck, everlasting tale of the Fitzgerald that now has come to mean all ships on the Great Lakes. All of them now are wrapped into the legend of the Fitzgerald, and Fitzgerald itself has moved on to being an icon.
Bruce Lynn at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum hopes the attention drawn to the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald reminds people of the important work that has been done and is being done by mariners working on the Great Lakes and potentially risking their lives.
We get wrapped up in the ship. What did the ship look like, or what kind of a ship was it? And sometimes the crew of that ship, whatever that ship may be, but at times can take a backseat to the ship itself or the story, those final moments. They were all crew, they all had families, and they were all part of this broader part of our history, that there's a huge importance to what those ships are doing out there today. There was a huge importance to what they were doing back then. It just was a lot less safe for them to be out there back then versus now.
The crew members were not just names, but people. And before Edmund Fitzgerald was the name of a ship, it was the name of a person who didn't even want his name painted on the hull of a freighter. When author L. Andra Warner was working on her book about the Edmund Fitzgerald, she received a call from an unexpected source.
The son of Edmund Fitzgerald, the one that's named out, the ship is named after, he got a hold of me. Somehow he knew I was writing a book. I wasn't in contact with him before. And he said his dad, was 80 when the ship went down. That's what he said. So he said at the funeral, he took his dad to the funeral because his dad wanted to go. Doctor said no. But he always felt somehow because his name was attached to it, it was his fault, that he was to blame somehow. He carried that with him.
The 29 men who were on the Edmund Fitzgerald on November 10, 1975, are still on the ship, their remains resting at the bottom of Lake Superior. We now know that was already the case when the Arthur M. Anderson turned around and risked its own crew's safety to search for the Edmund Fitzgerald. There were other ships that joined the search as well, among them the William Clay Ford, which was already at anchor when it set out to look for survivors. The Arthur M. Anderson is still afloat and was hauling ore until the 2024-25 shipping season. Since the end of that shipping season, the Anderson has been docked in Toledo in what the shipping industry terms long-term layup. It is unknown whether the ship will ever work the lakes again. A sailor who was on the Anderson that night told John Bacon they went back out because, quote, "that's what you do, and they would have done it for us." The last time the Anderson arrived in Duluth, possibly the last time it will ever arrive in Duluth, it was a foggy night, December 27th, 2024. As the Anderson passed beneath the aerial lift bridge, the ship and the bridge exchanged a master's salute. Instead of the more typical 3-blast salute, a 5-blast master's salute is used to signify a special occasion. In this audio from the Duluth Harbor Cam, you can hear that exchange of horns, and you can hear the cheers of people who lined the piers, recognizing the ship whose crew, 50 years ago, did everything they could to help those 29 men locked in a life and death battle with the gales of November on board the Edmund Fitzgerald. Edmund Fitzgerald, 50 Years Below is a production of the Duluth News Tribune. This podcast is written and narrated by Jay Gabler, with audio engineering by Wyatt Buckner and Dan Williamson. The audio of this episode was edited by Wyatt Buckner. Our editors on this project are Katie Roman and Barrett Chase, and our executive editor is Rick Lubbers. Original score composed by William Brueggemann. This episode's Newsweek excerpt was read by Barrett Chase. Thanks to our guests on this episode: L. Andrew Warner, John U. Bacon, David James Carlson, John Crowley, Rob Hoffman, Bruce Lynn, Kaylee Matuzak, Paul Sabrin, Hayes Scriven, Dave Strandberg, Sarah Summers-Liebke, Frederick Stonehouse, and Terrence Tysall. Thanks also to Duluth Harbor Cam for permission to use audio from the arrival of the Arthur M. Anderson. Read more stories about the Edmund Fitzgerald and learn more about this podcast at DuluthNewsTribune.com. In closing, we remember the last crew of the Edmund Fitzgerald: Gordon McClellan, Joseph Mays, Thomas Benson, Ralph Walton, Blaine Wilhelm, Oliver Champeau, Russell Haskell, Paul Ripa, Mark Thomas, Carl Peckall, Thomas Edwards, Edward Binden, George Hall, Nolan Church, Frederick Beecher, Alan Coleman, Robert Rafferty, David Weiss, Bruce Hudson, William Spengler, Ransom Cundy, Thomas Bergeson, John Poviak, Eugene O'Brien, John Simmons, Michael Armagost, James Pratt, John McCarthy, and Ernest McSorley.